fully diluted, after special charges.
完全摊薄特殊费用后。
4.19, 5.35. For the fourth quarter alone, only two figures are given.
仅在第4季度只给出了2个数字。
Primary earnings.
主要收益
$1.58, $1.56. Net income after special charges.
净收入扣除特殊费用后。
0.70, 1.56. What do all these additional earnings mean? Which earnings are true earnings for the year and the December quarter? If the latter should be taken at 70 cents, the net income after special charges, the annual rate would be $2.80 instead of $6.32, and the price 62 would be 22 times earnings, instead of the 10 times we started with.
所有这些额外的收益是什么意思？哪些收益是1年和12月季度的真实收益？如果后者应以70美分计算，即扣除特殊费用后的净收入，那么年率将是 2.80 美元，而不是 6.32 美元。价格62将是22倍的收益，而不是我们开始时的10倍。
Part of the question as to the true earnings of Alcoa can be answered quite easily. The reduction from $5.20 to $5.01 to allow for the effects of dilution is clearly called for. Alcoa has a large bond issue convertible into common stock to calculate the earning power of the common based on the 1970 results. It must be assumed that the conversion privilege will be exercised if it should prove profitable to the bondholders to do so. The amount involved in the Alcoa picture is relatively small and hardly deserves detailed comment. But in other cases, making allowance for conversion rights and the existence of stock purchase warrants can reduce the apparent earnings by half or more. We shall present examples of a really significant dilution factor below, page 411. The financial services are not always consistent in their allowance for the dilution factor in their reporting and analyses. Asterisk.
关于 Alcoa 的真实收益的部分问题可以很容易的回答。为了考虑到稀释的影响，从 5.20 美元减少到 5.01 美元，这显然是必要的。Alcoa 有一大笔可转换为普通股的债券发行，要计算基于1970年结果的普通股的盈利能力，必须假设如果债券持有人发现转换有利可图，他们将会行使转换权。在 Alcoa 的情况中，涉及的金额相对较小，几乎不值得详细评论。但在其他情况下，考虑到转换权和股票购买权的存在，可能会将表面上的收益减半，甚至更多。我们将在下面第411页提供一个真正重要的稀释因素的例子。金融服务在他们的报告和分析中对稀释因素的考虑并不总是一致的。
Let us turn now to the matter of special charges. This figure of $18,800,000, or 88 cents per share, deducted in the fourth quarter, is not unimportant. Is it to be ignored entirely, or fully recognized as an earnings reduction, or partly recognized and partly ignored? The alert investor might ask himself also, how does it happen that there was a virtual epidemic of such special charge-offs appearing after the close of 1970, but not in previous years? Could there possibly have been some fine Italian hands at work with the accounting, but always, of course, within the limits of the permissible? When we look closely, we may find that such losses, charged off before they actually occur, can be charmed away, as it were, with no unhappy effect on either past or future primary earnings. In some extreme cases, they might be availed of to make subsequent earnings appear nearly twice as large as in reality, by a more or less prestidigitated treatment of the tax credit involved.
现在让我们转向特殊费用的问题。在第4季度扣除的这个1880万美元，或者说每股88美分的数字，并非无关紧要。它应该被完全忽视，还是完全被认为是收益的减少，或者部分被认可，部分被忽视？警觉的投资者也可能会问自己，为什么在1970年结束后出现了这样一种特殊费用的疫情，但在前几年却没有？可能有一些精细的意大利手在会计上做文章，当然，总是在允许的范围内。当我们仔细观察时，我们可能会发现这样的损失在它们实际发生之前就被冲销，可以说是被消除了，对过去或未来的主要收益没有任何不愉快的影响。在一些极端的情况下，他们可能会利用这些损失，使后续的收益看起来几乎是实际的2倍，通过对涉及的税收抵免的或多或少的巧妙处理。
In dealing with Alcoa's special charges, the first thing to establish is how they arose. The footnotes are specific enough. The deductions came from four sources, viz.
在处理 Alcoa 的特殊费用时，首先要确定的是它们是如何产生的。脚注已经足够具体了。扣除项来自4个来源，即
Management's estimate of the anticipated cost of closing down the manufactured products division.
管理层对关闭制造产品部门预期成本的估计。
Ditto for closing down Alcoa Castings Company as plants.
同样，对关闭 Alcoa 铸造公司工厂的预期成本的估计。
Ditto for losses in phasing out Alcoa Credit Company.
同样，对逐步淘汰 Alcoa 信贷公司的损失的估计。
Also, estimated cost of $5.3 million associated with completion of the contract for a curtain wall.
此外，与完成幕墙合同相关的预计成本为530万美元。
All of these items are related to future costs and losses. It is easy to say that they are not part of the regular operating results of 1970, but if so, where do they belong? Are they so extraordinary and non-recurring as to belong nowhere? A widespread enterprise such as Alcoa, doing a $1.5 billion business annually, must have a lot of divisions, departments, affiliates, and the like. Would it not be normal rather than extraordinary for one or more to prove unprofitable and to require closing down? Similarly for such things as a contract to build a wall. Suppose that any time a company had a loss on any part of its business, it had the bright idea of charging it off as a special item, and thus reporting its primary earnings per share so as to include only its profitable contracts and operations? Like King Edward VII's sundial that marked only the sunny hours. Asterisk.
所有这些项目都与未来的成本和损失有关。人们很容易说它们不是1970年的常规经营结果的一部分，但如果是这样，它们应该属于哪里呢？它们是否如此非常规且不重复，以至于无处安放？像 Alcoa 这样的大型企业，每年的业务额达到15亿美元，必然有很多部门、分公司、附属机构等等。如果其中一个或多个部门证明无利可图，需要关闭，这难道不是正常的，而不是非常规的吗？同样的，像建造墙壁的合同这样的事情，假设任何时候公司在其业务的任何部分有损失，它都有将其作为特殊项目冲销的好主意，从而报告其主要收益每股，以便只包括其有利可图的合同和运营。就像爱德华7世的日晷，只标记阳光时刻。星号。
The readers should note two ingenious aspects of the Alcoa procedure we have been discussing. The first is that by anticipating future losses, the company escapes the necessity of allocating the losses themselves to an identifiable year. They don't belong in 1970 because they were not actually taken in that year. And they won't be shown in the year when they are actually taken because they have already been provided for. Neat work, but might it not be just a little misleading?
读者应注意，我们一直在讨论的 Alcoa 程序的2个巧妙之处。首先，通过预期未来的损失，公司避免了将损失本身分配到可识别的年份的必要性。它们不属于1970年，因为它们实际上并未在那一年产生，并且在实际发生的年份，它们也不会被显示出来，因为它们已经被提前计入。这是个巧妙的做法，但可能有点误导人。
The Alcoa footnote says nothing about the future tax saving from these losses. Most other statements of this sort state specifically that only the after-tax effect has been charged off. If the Alcoa figure represents future losses before the related tax credit, then not only will future earnings be freed from the weight of these charges, as they are actually incurred, but they will be increased by a tax credit of some 50% thereof. It is difficult to believe that the accounts will be handled that way. But it is a fact that certain companies which have had large losses in the past have been able to report future earnings without charging the normal taxes against them, in that way making a very fine profits appearance indeed. Based paradoxically enough on their past disgraces, tax credits resulting from past years' losses are now being shown separately as special items, but they will enter into future statistics as part of the final net income figure. However, a reserve now set up for future losses, if net of expected tax credit, should not create an addition of this sort to the net income of later years.
Alcoa 的角注对这些损失的未来税收节省一事没有提及。大多数此类声明明确指出，只有税后效应被冲销， 如果 Alcoa 的数字代表了与相关税收抵扣前的未来损失，那么未来的收益不仅会从这些费用的负担中解脱出来，因为它们实际上已经发生，而且还会因为大约 50% 的税收抵扣而增加。很难相信账目会以这种方式处理，但事实上，某些过去有大量损失的公司已经能够报告未来的收益，而不需要对其正常的税收进行冲销，以此方式确实创造了非常好的利润表现，基于他们过去的丑闻。由于过去几年的损失产生的税收抵扣现在被单独显示为特殊项目，但它们将作为最终的净收入数字的一部分纳入未来的统计数据。然而，现在为未来损失设立的储备，如果净额预期税收抵扣，不应该在以后几年的净收入中创造这种增加。
The other ingenious feature is the use by Alcoa and many other companies of the 1970 year-end for making these special charge-offs. The stock market took what appeared to be a bloodbath in the first half of 1970. Everyone expected relatively poor results for the year for most companies. Wall Street was now anticipating better results in 1971, 1972, etc. What a nice arrangement, then, to charge as much as possible to the bad year, which had already been written off mentally and had virtually receded into the past, leaving the way clear for nicely fattened figures in the next few years. Perhaps this is good accounting, good business policy, and good for management-shareholder relationships. But we have lingering doubts.
另一个巧妙的特点是 Alcoa 和许多其他公司在1970年年底进行这些特殊冲销的使用。股市在1970年上半年似乎遭受了重创，每个人都预期大多数公司在那一年的结果相对较差。华尔街现在预期在1971年、1972年等年份会有更好的结果。那么，将尽可能多的费用计入已经被心理上写下，并实际上已经退入过去的糟糕的一年，是多么好的安排，为接下来几年的丰厚数字腾出了道路。也许这是好的会计，好的商业政策，对于管理层股东关系也是好的。但我们仍有疑虑。
The combination of widely, or should it be wildly, diversified operations with the impulse to clean house at the end of 1970 has produced some strange-looking footnotes to the annual reports. The reader may be amused by the following explanation given by a New York Stock Exchange company, which shall remain unnamed, of its special items aggregating $2,357,000, or about a third of the income before charge-offs, consists of provision for closing Spalding United Kingdom operations, provision for reorganizational expenses of a division, costs of selling a small baby pants and bib manufacturing company, disposing of part interest in a Spanish car leasing facility, and liquidation of a ski boot operation. Asterisk.
广泛或者应该说疯狂的多元化运营与在1970年底清理房子的冲动，产生了一些看起来很奇怪的年度报告角注。读者可能会对以下由一家纽约证券交易所公司，其名称将保密，对其特殊项目总计$235.7千的解释感到好笑。这大约是冲销前收入的1/3，包括关闭 Spalding 英国运营的准备金、部门重组费用的准备金、出售小型婴儿裤和围兜制造公司的成本、处置西班牙汽车租赁设施的部分利益，以及清算滑雪靴业务。星号。
Years ago, the strong companies used to set up contingency reserves out of the profits of good years to absorb some of the bad effects of depression years to come. The underlying idea was to equalize the reported earnings, more or less, and to improve the stability factor in the company's record. A worthy motive, it would seem, but the accountants quite rightly objected to the practice as misstating the true earnings. They insisted that each year's results be presented as they were, good or bad, and the shareholders and analysts be allowed to do the averaging or equalizing for themselves. We seem now to be witnessing the opposite phenomenon, with everyone charging off as much as possible against forgotten 1970, so as to start 1971 with a slate not only clean but specially prepared to show pleasing per share figures in the coming years.
多年前，强大的公司曾经利用好年份的利润设立应急储备，以吸收即将到来的萧条年份的一些不良影响。基本的想法是使报告的收益更或少地平等，并提高公司记录的稳定性因素。这似乎是一个值得赞扬的动机，但会计师完全有理由反对这种做法，因为它误报了真实的收益。 他们坚持每年的结果应该按照实际情况呈现，无论好坏，让股东和分析师自己进行平均或平等化。我们现在似乎正在见证相反的现象，每个人都尽可能多地冲销旺季的1970年，以便以一个不仅干净，而且特别准备好在未来几年显示令人愉快的每股收益的状态开始1971年。
It is time to return to our first question. What then were the true earnings of Alcoa in 1970? The accurate answer would be the $5.01 per share, after dilution, less that part of the 82 cents of special charges that may properly be attributed to occurrences in 1970. But we do not know what that portion is, and hence we cannot properly state the true earnings for the year. The management and the auditors should have given us their best judgment on this point, but they did not do so. And furthermore, the management and the auditors should have provided for deduction of the balance of these charges from the ordinary earnings of a suitable number of future years, say, not more than 5. This evidently they will not do either, since they have already conveniently disposed of the entire sum as a 1970 special charge.
现在是时候回到我们的第一个问题，那么 Alcoa 在1970年的真实收益是多少呢？准确的答案应该是经过摊薄后的每股 5.01 美元，减去可以适当递归因于1970年发生的特殊费用82美分的部分。但我们不知道那部分是多少，因此我们不能正确地说明那一年的真实收益。管理层和审计师应该在这一点上给出他们的最佳判断，但他们没有这样做。而且，管理层和审计师应该提供从适当数量的未来年份的普通收益中扣除这些费用的余额，比如不超过5年。显然，他们也不会这样做，因为他们已经方便地将整个金额作为1970年的特殊费用处理掉了。
The more seriously investors take the per-share earnings figures as published, the more necessary it is for them to be on their guard against accounting factors of one kind and another that may impair the true comparability of the numbers. We have mentioned 3 sorts of these factors: the use of special charges, which may never be reflected in the per-share earnings, the reduction in the normal income tax deduction by reason of past losses, and the dilution factor implicit in the existence of substantial amounts of convertible securities or warrants. 1. A fourth item that has had a significant effect on reported earnings in the past is the method of treating depreciation, chiefly as between the straight line and the accelerated schedules. We refrain from details here, but as an example current as we write, let us mention the 1970 report of Train Company. This firm showed an increase of nearly 20% in per-share earnings over 1969, $3.29 versus $2.76, but half of this came from returning to the older straight-line depreciation rates, less burdensome on earnings than the accelerated method used the year before. The company will continue to use the accelerated rate on its income tax return, thus deferring income tax payments on the difference. Still another factor, important at times, is the choice between charging off research and development costs in the year they are incurred or amortizing them over a period of years. Finally, let us mention the choice between the FIFO, first in first out, and LIFO, last in first out, methods of valuing inventories. Asterisk.
投资者越是认真对待公布的每股收益数字，他们就越需要警惕可能损害数字真实可比性的各种会计因素。我们提到了这些因素的3种类型：使用特殊费用的使用，这些费用可能永远不会反映在每股收益中，由于过去的损失减少了正常的所得税扣除，以及存在大量可转换证券或认股权证的稀释因素。一过去对报告收益产生重大影响的第4项是处理折旧的方法，主要是在直线法和加速法之间。我们在这里不详细说明，但是以我们正在写的当前为例，让我们提一下 Train Co 的1970年报告。这家公司的每股收益比1969年增加了近20%， 3.29美元对比 2.76美元，但其中一半来自于回归到较旧的直线折旧率，这对收益的负担比前一年使用的加速方法要小。该公司将继续在其所得税申报上使用加速率，从而推迟对差额的所得税支付。还有另一个因素，有时很重要，那就是选择在发生的年份冲销研发成本，还是在几年内摊销它们。最后，让我们提一下选择 FIFO 先进先出和 LIFO 后进先出方法对库存进行估值。星号
An obvious remark here would be that investors should not pay any attention to these accounting variables if the amounts involved are relatively small. But Wall Street being as it is, even items quite minor in themselves can be taken seriously. 2 days before the Alcoa report appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the paper had quite a discussion of the corresponding statement of Dow Chemical. It closed with the observation that many analysts had been troubled by the fact that Dow had included a 21-cent item in regular profits for 1969, instead of treating it as an item of extraordinary income. Why the fuss? Because, evidently, evaluations of Dow Chemical involving many millions of dollars in the aggregate seemed to depend on exactly what was the percentage gain for 1969 over 1968. In this case, either 9% or 4.5%. This strikes us as rather absurd. It is very unlikely that small differences involved in one year's results could have any bearing on future average profits or growth, and on a conservative, realistic valuation of the enterprise.
显而易见的一点是，如果涉及的金额相对较小，投资者不应该过分关注这些会计变量。但是，就华尔街而言，即使是相对微不足道的项目，也可能被认真对待。在《华尔街日报》发布Alcoa报告的2天前，该报对陶氏化学的对应声明进行了深入的讨论。他以许多分析师对陶氏化学在1969年的常规利润中包含了21美分的项目，而不是将其视为非常收入的项目这一事实感到困扰而结束。为什么会有这种纷争？因为显然，涉及到数百万美元的陶氏化学的评估似乎取决于1969年相对于1968年的百分比增长究竟是多少，在这种情况下是9%还是1/42分号？这让我们感到有些荒谬。一年结果中涉及的小差异不太可能对未来的平均利润或增长，以及对企业的保守、现实的估值产生任何影响。
By contrast, consider another statement also appearing in January 1971. This concerned Northwest Industries Incorporated, S report for 1970. The company was planning to write off, as a special charge, not less than $264 million in one fell swoop. Of this, $200 million represents the loss to be taken on the proposed sale of the railroad subsidiary to its employees, and the balance a write-down of a recent stock purchase. These sums would work out to a loss of about $35 per share of common before dilution offsets, or twice its then current market price. Here we have something really significant. If the transaction goes through, and if the tax laws are not changed, this loss provided for in 1970 will permit Northwest Industries to realize about $400 million of future profits within 5 years from its other diversified interests without paying income tax thereon. What will then be the real earnings of that enterprise? Should they be calculated with or without provision for the nearly 50% in income taxes which it will not actually have to pay? In our opinion, the proper mode of calculation would be first to consider the indicated earning power on the basis of full income tax liability and to derive some broad idea of the stock's value based on that estimate. To this should be added some bonus figure, representing the value per share of the important but temporary tax exemption the company will enjoy. Allowance must be made, also, for a possible large-scale dilution in this case. Actually, the convertible preferred issues and warrants would more than double the outstanding common shares if the privileges are exercised.
相比之下，考虑另一份也在1971年1月出现的声明，这涉及到西北工业公司1970年的报告。星号该公司计划一次性作为特殊费用冲销不少于2.64亿美元，其中2亿美元代表了拟议中的铁路子公司向其员工出售的损失，余额是最近股票购买的减记。这些金额将导致美股普通股在稀释抵销前的损失约为35美元，或是其当时市场价格的2倍。这里我们有一些真正重要的东西。如果交易成立，且如果税法没有改变，1970年预计的这笔损失将使西北工业公司在未来5年内从其他多元化利益中实现约4亿美元的利润，而无需支付所得税。星号那么，该企业的真实收益将是多少？他们应该计算有或没有准备支付近50%的所得税，而实际上并不需要支付。在我们看来，正确的计算方式应该首先考虑基于全额所得税负债的预期盈利能力，并根据该估计得出股票价值的大致概念，然后应该加上一些奖金数字，代表公司将享受的重要但暂时的税收豁免的每股价值。 在这种情况下，还必须考虑可能的大规模稀释。实际上，可转换优先股发行和认股权证将使流通的普通股数量增加1倍以上，如果行使这些权利的话。
All this may be confusing and wearisome to our readers, but it belongs in our story. Corporate accounting is often tricky, security analysis can be complicated. Stock valuations are really dependable only in exceptional cases. For most investors, it would be probably best to assure themselves that they are getting good value for the prices they pay, and let it go at that.
所有这些可能会让我们的读者感到困惑和疲倦，但这是我们故事的一部分。公司会计往往很棘手，证券分析可能很复杂，股票估值只有在特殊情况下才真正可靠。对于大多数投资者来说，最好的方式可能是确保他们付出的价格能得到良好的价值，就此打住。
Use of average earnings.
平均收益的使用。
In former times, analysts and investors paid considerable attention to the average earnings over a fairly long period in the past, usually from 7 to 10 years. This mean figure asterisk was useful for ironing out the frequent ups and downs of the business cycle, and it was thought to give a better idea of the company's earning power than the results of the latest year alone. One important advantage of such an averaging process is that it will solve the problem of what to do about nearly all the special charges and credits. They should be included in the average earnings. For certainly most of these losses and gains represent a part of the company's operating history. If we do this for Alcoa, the average earnings for 1961 to 1970 10 years would appear as $3.62 and for the 7 years 1964 to 1970 as $4.62 per share. If such figures are used in conjunction with ratings for growth and stability of earnings during the same period, they could give a really informing picture of the company's past performance.
在过去，分析师和投资者对过去相当长的时间内的平均收益给予了相当大的关注，通常是7到10年。这个平均数信号对于平滑经济周期的频繁起伏很有用，人们认为它比仅仅依赖最近1年的结果更能反映公司的盈利能力。这种平均过程的一个重要优点是，它将解决如何处理几乎所有特殊费用和信贷的问题，它们应该包含在平均收益中。因为这些损失和收益肯定代表了公司运营历史的一部分。如果我们对 Alcoa 进行这样的处理，1961至1970年10年的平均收益将显示为每股3.62美元，1964至1970年7年的平均收益为每股4.62美元。如果使用这样的数字，并结合在同一时期内对收益增长和稳定性的评级，它们可以真实地反映公司过去的业绩。
Calculation of the past growth rate.
过去增长率的计算。
It is of prime importance that the growth factor in a company's record be taken adequately into account. Where the growth has been large, the recent earnings will be well above the 7 or 10-year average, and analysts may deem these long-term figures irrelevant. This need not be the case. The earnings can be given in terms both of the average and the latest figure. We suggest that the growth rate itself be calculated by comparing the average of the last 3 years with corresponding figures 10 years earlier. Where there is a problem of special charges or credits, it may be dealt with on some compromise basis. Note the following calculation for the growth of Alcoa as against that of Sears Roebuck and the DJIA Group as a whole.
确保充分考虑公司记录中的增长因素是至关重要的。如果增长很大，最近的收益将远高于7年或10年的平均值，分析师可能会认为这些长期数字无关紧要。这不一定是这样。收益可以同时以平均值和最新数字表示。我们建议通过比较最近3年的平均值和10年前的相应数字来计算增长率。如果存在特殊费用或信贷的问题，可以通过一些妥协的方式来处理。注意以下计算 Alcoa 的增长与希尔斯罗巴克和 DJIA 整体的增长的对比。
Comment. These few figures could be made the subject of a long discussion. They probably show as well as any others, derived by elaborate mathematical treatment, the actual growth of earnings for the long period 1958 to 1970. But how relevant is this figure, generally considered central in common stock valuations, to the case of Alcoa? Its past growth rate was excellent, actually a bit better than that of acclaimed Sears Roebuck and much higher than that of the DJIA composite. But the market price at the beginning of 1971 seemed to pay no attention to this fine performance. Alcoa sold at only 11.5 times the recent 3-year average, while Sears sold at 27 times and the DJIA itself at 15 plus times. How did this come about? Evidently, Wall Street has fairly pessimistic views about the future course of Alcoa's earnings, in contrast with its past record. Surprisingly enough, the high price for Alcoa was made as far back as 1959. In that year, it sold at 116, or 45 times its earnings. This compares with a 1959 adjusted high price of 25.5 for Sears Roebuck, or 20 times its then earnings. Even though Alcoa's profits did show excellent growth thereafter, it is evident that in this case the future possibilities were greatly overestimated in the market price. It closed 1970 at exactly half of the 1959 high, while Sears tripled in price and the DJIA moved up nearly 30%.
评论：这些数字可以成为长篇讨论的主题。它们可能像任何其他通过复杂数学处理得出的数字一样，显示了1958至1970年长期的实际收益增长。但是，这个通常被认为是普通股估值的中心数字，对 Alcoa 的情况有多大的相关性呢？其过去的增长率非常优秀，实际上比备受赞誉的谢尔斯罗巴克稍好一些，远高于 DJIA 的综合指数。但是，1971年初的市场价格似乎没有注意到这个优秀的表现。Alcoa 的售价只有最近3年平均值的11/2倍，而希尔斯的售价是27倍 ，DJIA 本身是15加倍。这是怎么回事？显然，华尔街对 Alcoa 未来收益的走势持相当悲观的观点，与其过去的记录形成了鲜明的对比。令人惊讶的是，Alcoa 的最高价格可以追溯到1959年，在那一年，它的售价为116美元，或是其收益的45倍。这与谢尔斯罗巴克在1959年调整后的最高价格25/2美元，或是其当时收益的20倍相比，尽管 Alcoa 的利润确实显示出了优秀的增长，但显然，在这种情况下，市场价格过高，估计了未来的可能性。它在1970年结束时的价格正好是1959年最高价的一半，而希尔斯的价格翻了3倍 ，DJIA 上涨了近30%。
Table 12.1.
表12-1。
It should be pointed out that Alcoa's earnings on capital funds asterisk have been only average or less, and this may be the decisive factor here. High multipliers have been maintained in the stock market only if the company has maintained better than average profitability.
应该指出的是 ，Alcoa 的资本收益率星号一直只是平均或以下，这可能是决定性的因素。只有在公司保持高于平均盈利能力的情况下，股市才能维持高倍数。
Let us apply at this point to Alcoa the suggestion we made in the previous chapter for a two-part appraisal process. Asterisk such an approach might have produced a past performance value for Alcoa of 10% of the DJIA, or $84 per share relative to the closing price of $840 for the DJIA in 1970. On this basis, the shares would have appeared quite attractive at their price of $57.25.
让我们在此将我们在上一章中提出的2部分评估过程的建议应用于 Alcoa。这样的方法可能会为 Alcoa 产生一个过去表现价值占 DJIA 的10%，或者相对于1970年 DJIA 收盘价840的每股84美元。基于这个基础，它们的价格在5/7/4时看起来相当吸引人。
To what extent should the senior analyst have marked down the past performance value to allow for adverse developments that he saw in the future? Frankly, we have no idea. Assume he had reason to believe that the 1971 earnings would be as low as $2.50 per share, a large drop from the 1970 figure, as against an advance expected for the DJIA. Very likely the stock market would take this poor performance quite seriously, but would it really establish the once mighty aluminum company of America as a relatively unprofitable enterprise? To be valued at less than its tangible assets behind the shares, in 1971 the price declined from a high of 70 in May to a low of 36 in December, against a book value of 55.
高级分析师应该在多大程度上降低过去表现价值，以便为他看到的未来不利发展留出余地？坦率地说，我们不知道。假设他有理由相信1971年的收益会低至每股$2.50，这是从1970年的数字大幅下降，而 DJIA 预计会上升。股市很可能会认真对待这种糟糕的表现， 但它真的会将曾经强大的美国铝业公司定位为相对不盈利的企业，其价值低于其股票背后的有形资产吗？1971年，价格从5月的最高点70下降到12月的最低点36，而账面价值为55。
Alcoa is surely a representative industrial company of huge size, but we think that its price and earnings history is more unusual, even contradictory, than that of most other large enterprises. Yet this instance supports to some degree the doubts we expressed in the last chapter as to the dependability of the appraisal procedure when applied to the typical industrial company.
Alcoa 无疑是一家代表性的大型工业公司，但我们认为其价格和收益历史比大多数其他大型企业更为不寻常，甚至矛盾。然而，这个例子在一定程度上支持了我们在上一章中对评估程序在应用于典型工业公司时的可靠性的质疑。
Commentary on Chapter 12.
第12章评论。
You can get ripped off easier by a dude with a pen than you can by a dude with a gun.
你被一个拿着笔的家伙骗得比被一个拿着枪的家伙更容易。
Bo Diddley.
伯蒂德利。
The Numbers Game.
数字游戏。
Even Graham would have been startled by the extent to which companies and their accountants pushed the limits of propriety in the past few years. Compensated heavily through stock options, top executives realized that they could become fabulously rich merely by increasing their company's earnings for just a few years running. Hundreds of companies violated the spirit, if not the letter, of accounting principles, turning their financial reports into gibberish, tarting up ugly results with cosmetic fixes, cloaking expenses, or manufacturing earnings out of thin air. Let's look at some of these unsavory practices.
即使是格雷厄姆也会对过去几年公司及其会计师在适当性方面的极限感到震惊。通过股票期权获得大量报酬的高级执行官们意识到，他们只需在连续几年内增加公司的收益，就可以变得非常富有。数百家公司违反了会计原则的精神，如果不是字面上的话，就是将他们的财务报告变成了无意义的文字，用化妆品修复丑陋的结果，掩盖费用，或者凭空创造收益。让我们看看这些不良的做法。
As if.
好像是这样。
Perhaps the most widespread bit of accounting hocus pocus was the pro forma earnings fad. There's an old saying on Wall Street that every bad idea starts out as a good idea, and pro forma earnings presentation is no different. The original point was to provide a truer picture of the long-term growth of earnings by adjusting for short-term deviations from the trend or for supposedly non-recurring events. A pro forma press release might, for instance, show what a company would have earned over the past year if another firm it just acquired had been part of the family for the entire 12 months.
也许最广泛的会计戏法是预计收益的热潮。华尔街有句老话说，每一个坏主意都是从一个好主意开始的，预计收益的呈现也不例外。最初的目的是通过调整短期偏离趋势或所谓的非经常性事件，提供收益长期增长的更真实的画面。例如，一份预计的新闻稿可能会显示，如果一家公司刚刚收购的另一家公司在过去的12个月里一直是家庭的一部分，那么这家公司在过去的1年里本来会赚多少钱。
But, as the naughty 1990s advanced, companies just couldn't leave well enough alone. Just look at these examples of pro forma flimflam.
然而，随着淘气的90年代的推进，公司们就是不能安于现状。看看这些形式上的欺诈行为的例子。
For the quarter ended September 30th, 1999, Infospace Incorporated presented its pro forma earnings as if it had not paid $159.9 million in preferred stock dividends.
截至1999年9月30日的季度， Infospace 公司公布了其形式上的收益，就好像它没有支付1.599亿美元的优先股股息一样。
For the quarter ended October 31st, 2001, BEA Systems Incorporated presented its pro forma earnings as if it had not paid $193 million in payroll taxes on stock options exercised by its employees.
截至2001年10月31日的季度， BEA 系统公司公布了其形式上的收益，就好像它没有支付1.93亿美元的员工股票期权工资税一样。
For the quarter ended March 31st, 2001, JDS Uniphase Corporation presented its pro forma earnings as if it had not paid $4 million in payroll taxes, had not lost $7 million investing in lousy stocks, and had not incurred $2.5 billion in charges related to mergers and goodwill.
截至2001年3月31日的季度 ，JDS Uniface 公司公布了其形式上的收益，就好像它没有支付400万美元的工资税，没有在糟糕的股票上损失700万美元，也没有因并购和商誉而产生25亿美元的费用。
In short, pro forma earnings enable companies to show how well they might have done if they hadn't done as badly as they did. Point 2 As an intelligent investor, the only thing you should do with pro forma earnings is ignore them.
简而言之，形式上的收益使公司能够展示，如果他们没有做得那么糟糕，他们可能会做得多好。作为一个聪明的投资者，你唯一应该对形式上的收益做的就是忽视它们。
Hungry for recognition.
渴望认可。
In 2000, Quest Communications International Incorporated, the telecommunications giant, looked strong. Its shares dropped less than 5% even as the stock market lost more than 9% that year.
2000年，电信巨头 Quest 通信国际公司看起来很强大，即使股市在那一年下跌了超过 9%， 它的股票也不到 5%。
But Quest's financial reports held an odd little revelation. In late 1999, Quest decided to recognize the revenues from its telephone directories as soon as the phone books were published, even though, as anyone who has ever taken out a Yellow Pages advertisement knows, many businesses pay for those ads in monthly installments. Abracadabra. That piddly-sounding change in accounting principle pumped up 1999 net income by $240 million after taxes, a fifth of all the money Quest earned that year.
但是 Quest 的财务报告中有一个奇怪的小揭示，在1999年底 ，Quest 决定一旦电话不出版，就确认其电话目录的收入。尽管，正如任何曾经在黄页广告中投放过广告的人都知道，许多企业是分期付款的。这个听起来微不足道的会计原则变更使1999年的净收入增加了 2.4 亿美元，这是 Quest 那一年所有收入的1/5。
Like a little chunk of ice crowning a submerged iceberg, aggressive revenue recognition is often a sign of dangers that run deep and loom large, and so it was at Quest. By early 2003, after reviewing its previous financial statements, the company announced that it had prematurely recognized profits on equipment sales, improperly recorded the cost of services provided by outsiders, inappropriately booked costs as if they were capital assets rather than expenses, and unjustifiably treated the exchange of assets as if they were outright sales. All told, Quest revenues for 2000 and 2001 had been overstated by $2.2 billion, including $80 million from the earlier change in accounting principle, which was now reversed. Point 3.
就像一个小冰块关在一个深藏不露的冰山上，激进的收入确认通常是深层和巨大危险的标志。Quest 就是这样。到2003年初，在审查了其以前的财务报表后，该公司宣布，它过早地确认了设备销售的利润，不当地记录了外部提供的服务的成本，不适当地将成本记为资本资产而非费用，并且不合理地将资产交换视为直接销售。总的来说， Quest 在2000年和2001年的收入被高估了22亿美元，其中包括早些时候的会计原则变更带来的8000万美元，现在已经被逆转。
Capital offenses.
资本罪行。
In the late 1990s, Global Crossing Limited had unlimited ambitions. The Bermuda-based company was building what it called the first integrated global fiber optic network over more than 100,000 miles of cables, largely laid across the floor of the world's oceans. After wiring the world, Global Crossing would sell other communications companies the right to carry their traffic over its network of cables. In 1998 alone, Global Crossing spent more than $600 million to construct its optical web. That year, nearly a third of the construction budget was charged against revenues as an expense called cost of capacity sold. If not for that $178 million expense, Global Crossing, which reported a net loss of $96 million, could have reported a net profit of roughly $82 million.
在20世纪90年代末，全球通信有限公司 Global Crossing Ltd. 的雄心壮志无可限量。这家总部位于百慕大的公司正在建设其所称的首个全球集成光纤网络，覆盖了超过10万英里的电缆，大部分都铺设在世界各大洋的海底。在全球布线之后，全球通信会向其他通信公司出售在其电缆网络上传输流量的权利。 仅在1998年，全球通信就花费了超过6亿美元来建设其光纤网络。那一年，近1/3的建设预算被作为一项名为已受容量成本的费用计入收入。如果没有这1.78亿美元的费用，全球通信其报告的净损失为9600万美元，本可以报告大约8200万美元的净利润。
The next year, says a bland footnote in the 1999 annual report, Global Crossing initiated service contract accounting. The company would no longer charge most construction costs as expenses against the immediate revenues it received from selling capacity on its network. Instead, a major chunk of those construction costs would now be treated not as an operating expense but as a capital expenditure, thereby increasing the company's total assets, instead of decreasing its net income. 4.
次年，如1999年年报中一条平淡无奇的脚注所述，全球通信开始实施服务合同会计。公司将不再将大部分建设成本作为销售网络容量所得及时收入的费用。相反，这些建设成本的大部分现在将被视为资本支出，而不是运营费用，从而增加了公司的总资产，而不是减少其净收入。4.
Poof. In one wave of the wand, Global Crossing's property and equipment assets rose by $575 million, while its cost of sales increased by a mere $350 million. Even though the company was spending money like a drunken sailor.
Sure. 一挥手，全球通信的财产和设备资产增加了5.75亿美元，而其销售成本仅增加了3.5亿美元，尽管公司花钱如流水。
Capital expenditures are an essential tool for managers to make a good business grow bigger and better. But malleable accounting rules permit managers to inflate reported profits by transforming normal operating expenses into capital assets. As the Global Crossing case shows, the intelligent investor should be sure to understand what and why a company capitalizes.
资本支出是管理者使优秀的业务变得更大更好的必要工具。但是，灵活的会计规则允许管理者通过将正常的运营费用转化为资本资产来夸大报告的利润。正如全球通信的案例所示，聪明的投资者应确保理解公司为何以及为何进行资本化。
An inventory story.
一个库存故事。
Like many makers of semiconductor chips, Micron Technology Incorporated suffered a drop in sales after 2000. In fact, Micron was hit so hard by the plunge in demand that it had to start writing down the value of its inventories, since customers clearly did not want them at the prices Micron had been asking. In the quarter ended May 2001, Micron slashed the recorded value of its inventories by $261 million. Most investors interpreted the write-down not as a normal or recurring cost of operations, but as an unusual event.
像许多半导体芯片制造商一样， Micron Technology Inc. 在2000年后的销售额下降。实际上 ，Micron 受到需求下降的打击如此之大，以至于不得不开始减记其库存的价值，因为客户显然不愿意按照 Micron 之前的要价购买。在2001年5月结束的季度， Micron 将其库存的记录价值削减了2.61亿美元。大多数投资者将这次减记解读为运营成本的正常或经常性费用，而不是一次性事件。
But look what happened after that.
但看看之后发生了什么。
Figure 12.1.
图12-1。
A block of the old chips.
旧芯片的一块。
Source: Micron Technology's financial reports.
来源 Micron Technology 的财务报告。
Micron booked further inventory write-downs in every one of the next 6 fiscal quarters. Was the devaluation of Micron's inventory a non-recurring event, or had it become a chronic condition? Reasonable minds can differ on this particular case, but one thing is clear: the intelligent investor must always be on guard for non-recurring costs that, like the Energizer Bunny, just keep on going. 5.
在接下来的6个财政季度中，美光科技进一步进行了库存减值。美光科技的库存贬值是一次性事件，还是已经成为一种慢性病？对于这个特殊案例，理性的人们可能会有不同的看法，但有一点是明确的：聪明的投资者必须时刻警惕那些像 Energizer 2一样一直持续下去的一次性成本。5.
The pension dimension.
养老金的维度。
In 2001, SBC Communications Incorporated which owns interests in Singular Wireless, Pactel, and Southern New England Telephone, earned $7.2 billion in net income, a stellar performance in a bad year for the overextended telecom industry. But that gain didn't come only from SBC's business. Fully $1.4 billion of it, 13% of the company's net income, came from SBC's pension plan.
2001年，拥有 Singular Wireless, Pactel 和 Southern New England Telephone 股权的 SBC 通信公司，净收入达到72亿美元。在电信行业负债过多的糟糕年份中，这是一次出色的表现。但这个收益并非完全来自 SBC 的业务，其中14亿美元占公司净收入的13%分号来自 SBC 的养老金计划。
Because SBC had more money in the pension plan than it estimated was necessary to pay its employees' future benefits, the company got to treat the difference as current income. One simple reason for that surplus: in 2001, SBC raised the rate of return it expected to earn on the pension plan's investments from 8.5% to 9.5%, lowering the amount of money it needed to set aside today.
因为 SBC 的养老金计划中的资金超过了其预计用于支付员工未来福利的必要金额，公司得以将差额视为当前收入。这个盈余的一个简单原因是，2001年 SBC 将其预期在养老金计划投资上的回报率从 8.5% 提高到 9.5% 分号，降低了其现在需要储备的资金量。
SBC explained its rosy new expectations by noting that for each of the 3 years ended 2001, our actual 10-year return on investments exceeded 10%. In other words, our past returns have been high, so let's assume that our future returns will be too. But that not only flunked the most rudimentary test of logic, it flew in the face of the fact that interest rates were falling to near-record lows, depressing the future returns on the bond portion of a pension portfolio.
SBC 通过指出，截至2001年的3年中，我们实际的10年投资回报率超过 10% 来解释其乐观的新预期。换句话说，我们过去的回报率很高，所以让我们假设我们未来的回报率也会很高。但这不仅没有通过最基本的逻辑测试，而且与利率正在降至近乎创纪录的低点，压低养老金投资组合中债券部分的未来回报这一事实相悖。
The same year, in fact, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway lowered the expected rate of return on its pension assets from 8.3% to 6.5%. Was SBC being realistic in assuming that its pension fund managers could significantly outperform the world's greatest investor? Probably not. In 2001, Berkshire Hathaway's pension fund gained 9.8%, but SBC's pension fund lost 6.9%.
实际上，同一年，沃伦·巴菲特的伯克希尔·哈撒韦公司将其养老金资产的预期回报率从 8.3% 降低到 6.5%。SBC 假设其养老金基金经理能够显著超越世界上最伟大的投资者，这是否现实？可能不是。2001年，伯克希尔·哈撒韦的养老金基金增长了 9.8%， 但 SBC 的养老金基金却损失了 6.9%。6.
Here are some quick considerations for the intelligent investor. Is the net pension benefit more than 5% of the company's net income? If so, would you still be comfortable with the company's other earnings if those pension gains went away in future years? Is the assumed long-term rate of return on planned assets reasonable? As of 2003, anything above 6.5% is implausible, while a rising rate is downright delusional.
以下是一些聪明投资者需要快速考虑的问题：公司的净养老金收益是否超过公司净收入的 5%？ 如果是，那么如果未来几年这些养老金收益消失，你是否仍然对公司的其他收益感到满意？假设的计划资产的长期回报率是否合理？截至2003年，超过 6.5% 的回报率是不可能的，而上升的回报率则完全是妄想。
Caveat investor.
投资者警惕。
A few pointers will help you avoid buying a stock that turns out to be an accounting time bomb.
以下几点建议将帮助你避免购买一个最终成为会计定时炸弹的股票。
Read backwards. When you research a company's financial reports, start reading on the last page and slowly work your way toward the front. Anything that the company doesn't want you to find is buried in the back, which is precisely why you should look there first.
反向阅读。当你研究一家公司的财务报告时，从最后一页开始阅读，慢慢向前翻。 公司不希望你发现的任何事情都会被埋在后面，这正是你应该首先在那里寻找的原因。
Read the notes. Never buy a stock without reading the footnotes to the financial statements in the annual report. Usually labeled Summary of Significant Accounting Policies, one key note describes how the company recognizes revenue, records inventories, treats installment or contract sales, expenses its marketing costs, and accounts for the other major aspects of its business. Point 7 in the other footnotes, watch for disclosures about debt, stock options, loans to customers, reserves against losses, and other risk factors that can take a big chomp out of earnings. Among the things that should make your antennae twitch are technical terms like capitalized, deferred, and restructuring, and plain English words signaling that the company has altered its accounting practices, like began, change, and however. None of those words mean you should not buy the stock, but all mean that you need to investigate further. Be sure to compare the footnotes with those in the financial statements of at least one firm that's a close competitor to see how aggressive your company's accountants are.
阅读注释：永远不要在没有阅读年度报告中财务报表脚注的情况下购买股票。这些脚注通常标有重要会计政策摘要，其中一个关键注释描述了公司如何确认收入、记录库存、处理分期或合同销售、支出其营销成本以及处理其业务的其他主要方面。在其他脚注中，要注意关于债务、股票期权、向客户贷款、预备对冲损失以及其他可能大幅度减少收益的风险因素的披露。应该引起你警觉的事情包括像资本化、推迟和重组这样的专业术语，以及表示公司已经改变其会计实践的普通英语词汇，如开始、改变和然而。这些词汇并不意味着你不应该购买股票，但都意味着你需要进一步调查。一定要将脚注与至少一个紧密竞争对手的财务报表中的脚注进行比较，以了解你的公司的会计师有多积极。
Read more. If you are an enterprising investor willing to put plenty of time and energy into your portfolio, then you owe it to yourself to learn more about financial reporting. That's the only way to minimize your odds of being misled by a shifty earnings statement. 3 solid books full of timely and specific examples are Martin Fridson and Fernando Alvarez's Financial Statement Analysis, Charles Mulford and Eugene Comiskey's The Financial Numbers Game, and Howard Schillett's Financial Shenanigans. 8.
阅读更多。如果你是一个愿意投入大量时间和精力到你的投资组合的进取型投资者，那么你有责任更多地了解财务报告。这是降低被不诚实的收益报告误导的唯一方法。3本充满及时和具体例子的实用书籍是 Martin Fridson 和 Fernando Alvarez 的财务报表分析， Charles Mulford 和 Eugene Comiskey 的财务数字游戏，以及 Howard Schillett 的财务骗局。
Chapter 13. A Comparison of 4 Listed Companies.
第13章4家上市公司的比较。
In this chapter, we should like to present a sample of security analysis and operation. We have selected, more or less at random, for companies which are found successively on the New York Stock Exchange list. These are Yeltare Corporation, a merger of Electric Autolite and Mergenthaler Linotype Enterprises, Emerson Electric Company, a manufacturer of electric and electronic products, Emery Air Freight, a domestic forwarder of air freight, and Emhart Corporation, originally a maker of bottling machinery only, but now also in builders' hardware. There are some broad resemblances between the 3 manufacturing firms, but the differences will seem more significant. There should be sufficient variety in the financial and operating data to make the examination of interest.
在本章中，我们希望展示一些安全分析的实际操作。我们随机选择了纽约证券交易所名单上连续出现的4家公司。这些公司是 Yeltare Corp、Electric Autolite 和 Mergenthaler Linotype 企业的合并， Emerson Electric Co. 电器和电子产品的制造商， Emery Air Freight 国内空运货物的转运商，和 Emhart Corp. 最初只是瓶装机械的制造商，但现在也涉足建筑硬件。这3家制造公司之间有一些广泛的相似性，但差异可能更为显著。财务和运营数据的多样性应该足以使这次检查引人关注。
In Table 13.1, we present a summary of what the 4 companies were selling for in the market at the end of 1970 and a few figures on their 1970 operations. We then detail certain key ratios, which relate on the one hand to performance and on the other to price. Comment is called for on how various aspects of the performance pattern agree with the relative price pattern. Finally, we shall pass the 4 companies in review, suggesting some comparisons and relationships and evaluating each in terms of the requirements of a conservative common stock investor.
在表13-1中，我们总结了1970年底4家公司在市场上的销售情况，以及他们1970年运营的一些数据。然后我们详细列出了一些关键比率，一方面与业绩有关，另一方面与价格有关。需要对业绩模式的各个方面如何与相对价格模式相符进行评论。最后，我们将对这4家公司进行回顾，提出一些比较和关系，并根据保守的普通股投资者的要求，对每家公司进行评估。
Table 13-2A comparison of 4 listed companies.
表13-2 4家上市公司的比较。
The most striking fact about the 4 companies is that the current price/earnings ratios vary much more widely than their operating performance or financial condition. 2 of the enterprises, ELTRA and Imhart, were modestly priced at only 9.7 times and 12 times the average earnings for 1968 to 1970, as against a similar figure of 15.5 times for the DJIA. The other 2, Emerson and Emery, showed very high multiples of 33 and 45 times such earnings. There is bound to be some explanation of a difference such as this, and it is found in the superior growth of the favored company's profits in recent years, especially by the freight forwarder. But the growth figures of the other 2 firms were not unsatisfactory.
关于这4家公司最引人注目的事实是，当前的市盈率变化比他们的运营业绩或财务状况变化更大。其中2家企业 ELTRA 和 Emery 的价格适中，只有1968至1970年平均收益的 9.7 倍和12倍，而 DJIA 的相似数字为 15.5 倍。另外2家 Emerson 和 Emery 显示出非常高的倍数，分别为33倍和45倍。这种差异必然有一些解释，这在最近几年受欢迎的公司利润的优越增长中可以找到，尤其是货运转运商。但是其他2家公司的增长数字并不令人不满意。
For more comprehensive treatment, let us review briefly the chief elements of performance as they appear from our figures.
为了更全面的处理，让我们简要回顾一下业绩的主要元素。
1. Profitability. All the companies show satisfactory earnings on their book value, but the figures for Emerson and Emery are much higher than for the other 2. A high rate of return on invested capital often goes along with a high annual growth rate in earnings per share. All the companies except Emery showed better earnings on book value in 1969 than in 1961. But the Emery figure was exceptionally large in both years. For manufacturing companies, the profit figure per dollar of sales is usually an indication of comparative strength or weakness. We use here the ratio of operating income to sales, as given in Standard & Poor's listed stock reports. Here again, the results are satisfactory for all 4 companies, with an especially impressive showing by Emerson. The changes between 1961 and 1969 vary considerably among the companies.
盈利能力。所有公司都在其账面价值上显示出满意的收益，但 Emerson 和 Emery 的数字比其他2家公司高得多。投入资本的高回报率通常伴随着每股收益的高年增长率。除了 Emery 之外，所有公司在1969年的账面价值收益都比1961年好，但是 Emery 在这2年的数字都非常大。对于制造公司，每销售$1的利润通常是比较强弱的指标。我们在这里使用 Standard & Poor's Listed Stock Reports 中给出的营业收入对销售的比率。这4家公司的结果都令人满意，尤其是 Emerson 的表现非常出色。1961年和1969年之间的变化在各公司之间有很大的不同。
2. Stability. This we measure by the maximum decline in per share earnings in any one of the past 10 years, as against the average of the 3 preceding years. No decline translates into 100% stability, and this was registered by the 2 popular concerns. But the shrinkages of ELTRA and Imhart were quite moderate in the poor year, 1970, amounting to only 8% each by our measurement, against 7% for the DJIA.
2. 稳定性。我们通过过去10年中任何一年的每股收益的最大下降幅度与前3年的平均值进行比较来衡量这一点。没有下降意味着100%的稳定性，这是由2家受欢迎的公司所注册的。但是在糟糕的一年1970年 Ultra 和 Emerald 的收缩相当温和，按我们的测量只有8%，而 DJIA 为7%。
3. Growth. The two low multiplier companies show quite satisfactory growth rates, in both cases doing better than the Dow Jones Group. The ELTRA figures are especially impressive when set against its low price/earnings ratio. The growth is of course more impressive for the high multiplier pair.
3. 增长。这两家低倍数公司的增长率相当令人满意，两者都比道琼斯集团做得更好。与其低的市盈率相比 ，Ultra 的数据尤其令人印象深刻。当然，对于高倍数的一对来说，增长更为显著。
4. Financial position. The three manufacturing companies are in sound financial condition, having better than the standard ratio of $2 of current assets for $1 of current liabilities. Emory Air Freight has a lower ratio, but it falls in a different category, and with its fine record, it would have no problem raising needed cash. All the companies have relatively low long-term debt. Dilution. Note. Emerson Electric had $163 million of market value of low-dividend convertible preferred shares outstanding at the end of 1970. In our analysis, we have made allowance for the dilution factor in the usual way by treating the preferred as if converted into common. This decreased recent earnings by about 10 cents per share, or some 4%.
4. 财务状况。这三家制造公司的财务状况稳健，其流动资产与流动负债的标准比率优于2:1。艾默里空运的比率较低，但它属于一个不同的类别。凭借其良好的记录，它在筹集所需现金时不会有任何问题。所有公司的长期债务相对较低。摊薄注意事项：爱默生电器在1970年底有1.63亿美元的低股息可转换优先股的市场价值。在我们的分析中，我们以通常的方式考虑了摊薄因素，将优先股视为已转换为普通股。这使得最近的收益减少了大约每股10美分，或约4%。
5. Dividends. What really counts is the history of continuance without interruption. The best record here is Emhart's, which has not suspended a payment since 1902. ELTRA's record is very good. Emerson's quite satisfactory. Emory Freight is a newcomer. The variations in payout percentage do not seem especially significant. The current dividend yield is twice as high on the cheap pair as on the dear pair, corresponding to the price/earnings ratios.
5. 股息。真正重要的是连续不断的历史。在这里最好的记录是 Emerald 的，自1902年以来没有停止过付款。Ultra 的记录非常好，爱默生的相当满意，爱默里货运是新来的。派息比例的变化似乎并不特别显著。当前的股息收益率在便宜的一对上是贵的一对的2倍，与市盈率相对应。
6. Price history. The reader should be impressed by the percentage advance shown in the price of all 4 of these issues, as measured from the lowest to the highest points during the past 34 years. In all cases, the low price has been adjusted for subsequent stock splits. Note that for the DJIA, the range from low to high was on the order of 11-1. For our companies, the spread has varied from only 17-1 for Emhart to no less than 528-1 for Emory Air Freight. Asterisk, these manifold price advances are characteristic of most of our older common stock issues, and they proclaim the great opportunities of profit that have existed in the stock markets of the past. But they may indicate also how overdone were the declines in the bear markets before 1950 when the low prices were registered. Both ELTRA and Emhart sustained price shrinkages of more than 50% in the 1969-70 price break. Emerson and Emory had serious, but less distressing, declines. The former rebounded to a new all-time high before the end of 1970, the latter in early 1971.
6. 价格历史。读者应该对这4个问题的价格都有所提高的百分比感到印象深刻，这是从过去34年中的最低点到最高点的测量。在所有情况下，低价格都已经调整了后续的股票拆分。请注意，对于 DJI 从低到高的范围大约是11-1，对于我们的公司，范围已经从 Emerald 的仅17-1变化到爱默里空运的不少于528-1。星号这些多样化的价格上涨是我们大多数老牌普通股问题的特征，它们宣告了过去股市中存在的巨大利润机会。但它们也可能表明，在1950年之前的熊市中，低价格被过度压低了。 Ultra 和 Emert 在1969至70年的价格下跌中都遭受了超过50%的价格缩水。爱默生和爱默里都有严重的，但不那么令人痛苦的下跌，前者在1970年底之前反弹到了新的历下高点，后者在1971年初。
General observations on the four companies.
对4家公司的一般观察。
Emerson Electric has an enormous total market value, dwarfing the other three companies combined. Asterisk, it is one of our goodwill giants, to be commented on later. A financial analyst blessed, or handicapped, with a good memory will think of an analogy between Emerson Electric and Zenith Radio, and that would not be reassuring. For Zenith had a brilliant growth record for many years. It too sold in the market for $1.7 billion in 1966. But its profits fell from $43 million in 1968 to only half as much in 1970, and in that year's big sell-off its price declined to 22.5 against the previous top of 89. High valuations entail high risks.
爱默生电器的总市值巨大，使其他3家公司相形见绌。幸好他是我们的善意巨人之一，稍后将对此进行评论。一个拥有良好记忆力的财务分析师或受到限制的，会想到爱默生电器和蚕丝广播之间的类比，这并不令人放心。因为蚕丝多年来一直有出色的增长记录，它在市场上也以17亿美元的价格出售，在1966年，但是它的利润从1968年的4300万美元下降到1970年的一半，而在那一年的大抛售中，它的价格从之前的顶点89下降到1/22。高估值带来高风险。
Emery Air Freight must be the most promising of the four companies in terms of future growth. If the price/earnings ratio of nearly 40 times its highest reported earnings is to be even partially justified. The past growth, of course, has been most impressive. But these figures may not be so significant for the future if we consider that they started quite small, at only $570,000 of net earnings in 1958. It often proves much more difficult to continue to grow at a high rate after volume and profits have already expanded to big totals. The most surprising aspect of Emery's story is that its earnings and market price continued to grow apace in 1970, which was the worst year in the domestic air passenger industry. This is a remarkable achievement indeed, but it raises the question whether future profits may not be vulnerable to adverse developments through increased competition, pressure for new arrangements between forwarders and airlines, etc. An elaborate study might be needed before a sound judgment could be passed on these points, but the conservative investor cannot leave them out of his general reckoning.
爱默里空运必须是4家公司中最有前途的，如果要部分证明其近40倍的最高报告收益的市盈率。过去的增长当然已经非常令人印象深刻，但是如果我们考虑到他们开始时相当小，只有1958年的净收益57万美元，那么这些数字对未来可能并不那么重要。在销售额和利润已经扩大到大量之后，以高速度继续增长通常会更加困难。爱默里的故事最令人惊讶的一面是，其收益和市场价格在1970年继续同步增长，那是国内航空客运业最糟糕的一年。这确实是一项了不起的成就，但他提出了一个问题，即未来的利润是否可能受到不利发展的影响，通过增加竞争，对货运商和航空公司之间新的安排的压力等。在对这些问题做出明智的判断之前，可能需要进行详尽的研究，但保守的投资者不能将它们排除在他的一般考虑之外。
Emhart and ELTRA. Emhart has done better in its business than in the stock market over the past 14 years. In 1958, it sold as high as 22 times the current earnings, about the same ratio as for the DJIA. Since then, its profits tripled, as against a rise of less than 100% for the Dow, but its closing price in 1970 was only a third above the 1958 high, versus 43% for the Dow. The record of ELTRA is somewhat similar. It appears that neither of these companies possesses glamour or sex appeal in the present market, but in all the statistical data they show up surprisingly well. Their future prospects? We have no sage remarks to make here, but this is what Standard & Poor's had to say about the four companies in 1971.
Emert 和 Ultra 过去14年来 Emert 在业务上的表现优于股市。1958年，它的售价高达当前收益的22倍， 与 DJIA 的比率大致相同。从那时起，它的利润翻了3倍，而道琼斯指数的上涨不到100%，但它在1970年的收盘价只比1958年的最高点高出1/3，而道琼斯指数为43%。Ultra 的记录有些类似。看来，这2家公司在当前市场上都没有魅力，或者说性吸引力，但在所有的统计数据中，他们的表现都出奇的好。他们的未来前景，我们在这里没有明智的评论，但这是标准普尔在1971年对4家公司的看法。
ELTRA long-term prospects. Certain operations are cyclical, but an established competitive position and diversification are offsetting factors.
Ultra 长期前景，某些操作是周期性的，但已建立的竞争地位和多元化是抵消因素。
Emerson Electric, while adequately priced at 71, on the current outlook, the shares have appeal for the long term. A continued acquisition policy together with a strong position in industrial fields and an accelerated international program suggests further sales and earnings progress.
爱默生电器虽然在当前的前景下71定价适中，但股票对长期有吸引力，持续的收购政策以及在工业领域的强大地位和加速的国际计划，表明进一步的销售和收益进展。
Emory Air Freight, the shares appear amply priced at 57 on current prospects, but are well worth holding for the long pull.
爱默里空运目前的前景看来，股票价格$57已经相当充足，但对于长期持有来说，它们非常值得。
Imhart, although restricted this year by lower capital spending in the glass container industry, earnings should be aided by an improved business environment in 1972. The shares are worth holding at 34.
艾姆哈特尽管今年由于玻璃容器行业的资本支出降低而受到限制，但1972年改善的商业环境应有助于提高收益。这些股票值得持有，$34。
Conclusions. Many financial analysts will find Emerson and Emory more interesting and appealing stocks than the other two, primarily, perhaps, because of their better market action, and secondarily because of their faster recent growth and earnings. Under our principles of conservative investment, the first is not a valid reason for selection. That is something for the speculators to play around with. The second has validity, but within limits. Can the past growth and the presumably good prospects of Emory Air Freight justify a price more than 60 times its recent earnings? When our answer would be maybe for someone who has made an in-depth study of the possibilities of this company and come up with exceptionally firm and optimistic conclusions. But not for the careful investor who wants to be reasonably sure in advance that he is not committing the typical Wall Street error of overenthusiasm for good performance in earnings and in the stock market. The same cautionary statements seem called for in the case of Emerson Electric, with a special reference to the market's current valuation of over $1 billion for the intangible, or earning power, factor here. We should add that the electronics industry, once a fair-haired child of the stock market, has in general fallen on disastrous days. Emerson is an outstanding exception, but it will have to continue to be such an exception for a great many years in the future before the 1970 closing price will have been fully justified by its subsequent performance.
结论：许多金融分析师可能会发现，爱默生和爱默里的股票比其他2家更有趣、更具吸引力，主要可能是因为他们的市场行动更好，其次是因为他们的收益增长速度更快。根据我们的保守投资原则，第一个原因并不是选择的有效理由，这是投机者可以玩弄的东西。第二个原因有一定的有效性，但是有限度。爱默里空运过去的增长和预期的良好前景能否证明其价格是最近收益的60倍以上？我们的答案可能是，对于那些对这家公司的可能性进行了深入研究并得出了非常坚定和乐观的结论的人来说，可能是的。但对于那些希望提前确保自己不会犯下对收益和股市表现过度热情的典型华尔街错误的谨慎投资者来说，答案是否定的。星号对于爱默生电器的情况似乎也需要做出同样的谨慎声明，特别是关于市场当前对这里的无形资产或盈利能力因素的估值超过$10亿。我们应该补充的是，电子行业曾经是股市的宠儿，但总的来说，现在已经陷入了灾难性的日子。爱默生是一个突出的例外，但在未来的许多年里，它必须继续成为这样的例外，才能使1970年的收盘价得到其后续表现的充分证明。
By contrast, both ELTRA at 27 and MHART at 33 have the earmarks of companies with sufficient value behind their price to constitute reasonably protected investments. Here the investor can, if he wishes, consider himself basically a part owner of these businesses, at a cost corresponding to what the balance sheet shows to be the money invested therein. Asterisk, the rate of earnings on invested capital has long been satisfactory. The stability of profits also, the past growth rate surprisingly so. The two companies will meet our 7 statistical requirements for inclusion in a defensive investor's portfolio. These will be developed in the next chapter, but we summarize them as follows.
相比之下 ，Altra 的$27和艾姆哈特的$33都具有公司背后有足够价值的标志，以构成合理保护的投资。在这里，投资者可以，如果他愿意，基本上认为自己是这些企业的部分所有者，其成本对应于资产负债表显示的投资金额。星号投资资本的收益率长期以来一直令人满意，利润的稳定性也是如此，过去的增长率出人意料的如此。这两家公司将满足我们在下一章将要发展的防御性投资者投资组合的7个统计要求。我们将它们总结如下
Adequate size.
足够的规模
A sufficiently strong financial condition.
足够强大的财务状况
Continued dividends for at least the past 20 years.
至少在过去的20年里持续分红
No earnings deficit in the past 10 years.
过去10年没有收益赤字
10-year growth of at least 1/3 in per share earnings.
每股收益的10年增长至少为1/3
Price of stock no more than 1.5 times net asset value.
股票价格不超过净资产价值的 1.5 倍
Price no more than 15 times average earnings of the past 3 years.
价格不超过过去3年平均收益的15倍
We make no predictions about the future earnings performance of ELTRA or MHART. In the investor's diversified list of common stocks, there are bound to be some that prove disappointing, and this may be the case for one or both of this pair. But the diversified list itself, based on the above principles of selection, plus whatever other sensible criteria the investor may wish to apply, should perform well enough across the years. At least, long experience tells us so.
我们对 Altra 或 MHART 未来的盈利表现不做任何预测。在投资者多元化的普通股名单中，肯定会有一些证明是令人失望的，这可能是这对股票中的1个或2个的情况。但是，基于上述选择原则的多元化名单本身，加上投资者可能希望应用的任何其他合理标准，应该在未来的岁月中表现得足够好。至少，长期的经验告诉我们如此。
A final observation. An experienced security analyst, even if he accepted our general reasoning on these 4 companies, would have hesitated to recommend that a holder of Emerson or Emery exchange his shares for ELTRA or MHART at the end of 1970, unless the holder understood clearly the philosophy behind the recommendation. There was no reason to expect that in any short period of time the low multiplier duo would outperform the high multipliers. The latter were well thought of in the market and thus had a considerable degree of momentum behind them, which might continue for an indefinite period. The sound basis for preferring ELTRA and MHART to Emerson and Emery would be the client's considered conclusion that he preferred value-type investments to glamour-type investments. Thus, to a substantial extent, common stock investment policy must depend on the attitude of the individual investor. This approach is treated at greater length in our next chapter.
最后一点观察，即使一位经验丰富的证券分析师接受了我们对这4家公司的一般推理，他也会犹豫是否建议 Emerson 或 Emery 的持有者在1970年底将其股票换成 Altra 或 MHART， 除非持有者清楚地理解了推荐背后的理念。没有理由期待在任何短期内低倍数的2家公司会超过高倍数的公司。后者在市场上备受好评，因此有相当大的动力在其背后，这可能会持续不确定的时间。选择 Altra 和 MHART 而不是 Emerson 和 Emery 的合理依据应该是客户经过深思熟虑的结论，他更喜欢价值型投资而不是魅力型投资。因此，在很大程度上，普通股投资政策必须取决于个别投资者的态度。我们在下一章将更详细地讨论这种方法。
Commentary on Chapter 13.
第13章评论。
In the Air Force, we have a rule. Check 6. A guy is flying along, looking in all directions and feeling very safe. Another guy flies up behind him at 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, is directly in front, and shoots. Most airplanes are shot down that way. Thinking that you're safe is very dangerous. Somewhere, there's a weakness you've got to find. You must always check 6 o'clock.
在空军中，我们有一条规则：检查6点。一个人正在飞行，四处张望，感觉非常安全。另一个人从他后面飞过来，在6点钟位置，12点钟是正前方，并开火。大多数飞机都是这样被击落的。认为自己安全是非常危险的。总有一个地方有你需要找到的弱点，你必须始终检查6点钟。
U.S. Air Force General Donald Katina.
美国空军将军唐纳德·库蒂纳。
E-business.
电子商务。
As Graham did, let's compare and contrast four stocks using their reported numbers as of December 31st, 1999, a time that will enable us to view some of the most drastic extremes of valuation ever recorded in the stock market.
就像格雷厄姆所做的那样，让我们比较和对比4只股票，使用他们在1999年12月31日报告的数字。这个时间点将使我们能够看到股市中有史以来最极端的估值。
Emerson Electric Company, ticker symbol, EMR, was founded in 1890 and is the only surviving member of Graham's original quartet. It makes a wide array of products, including power tools, air conditioning equipment, and electrical motors.
爱默生电气公司股票代码 EMR 成立于1890年，是格雷厄姆原始4重奏中唯一幸存的成员。它生产各种产品，包括电动工具、空调设备和电动机。
EMC Corporation, ticker symbol, EMC, dates back to 1979 and enables companies to automate the storage of electronic information over computer networks.
EMC 公司股票代码 EMC 可以追溯到1979年，它使公司能够通过计算机网络自动存储电子信息。
Expeditors International of Washington Incorporated, ticker symbol, EXPD, founded in Seattle in 1979, helps shippers organize and track the movement of goods around the world.
华盛顿州埃克斯皮迪托国际公司股票代码 EXPD 成立于1979年的西雅图，帮助货主组织和跟踪全球货物的运动。
Exodus Communications Incorporated, ticker symbol, EXDS, hosts and manages websites for corporate customers, along with other internet services. It first sold shares to the public in March 1998.
埃克索达斯通信公司股票代码 EXDS 为企业客户托管和管理网站，同时提供其他互联网服务。该公司于1998年3月首次向公众出售股票。
This table summarizes the price, performance, and valuation of these companies as of year-end 1999.
此表格总结了这些公司在1999年年底的价格、表现和估值。
Electric, not electrifying.
电力，但并非令人激动。
The most expensive of Graham's four stocks, Emerson Electric, ended up as the cheapest in our updated group. With its base in old economy industries, Emerson looked boring in the late 1990s. In the internet age, who cared about Emerson's heavy-duty wet-dry vacuums? The company's shares went into suspended animation. In 1998 and 1999, Emerson stock lagged the S&P 500 index by a cumulative 49.7 percentage points, a miserable underperformance.
在格雷厄姆的4只股票中，最昂贵的爱默生电器最终成为我们更新的组中最便宜的股票。爱默生在老牌经济行业中有着坚实的基础，因此在20世纪90年代末看起来有些乏味。在互联网时代，谁会关心爱默生的重型湿干吸尘器呢？该公司的股票陷入了停滞状态。在1998年和1999年，爱默生的股票在标普500指数中落后了累计49.7个百分点，表现极其糟糕。
But that was Emerson the stock. What about Emerson the company? In 1999, Emerson sold $14.4 billion worth of goods and services, up nearly $1 billion from the year before. On those revenues, Emerson earned $1.3 billion in net income, or 6.9% more than in 1998. Over the previous 5 years, earnings per share had risen at a robust average rate of 8.3%. Emerson's dividend had more than doubled to $1.30 per share. Book value had gone from $6.69 to $14.27 per share. According to Value Line, throughout the 1990s, Emerson's net profit margin and return on capital, key measures of its efficiency as a business, had stayed robustly high, around 9% and 18% respectively. What's more, Emerson had increased its earnings for 42 years in a row and had raised its dividend for 43 straight years, one of the longest runs of steady growth in American business. At year-end, Emerson's stock was priced at 17.7 times the company's net income per share. Like its power tools, Emerson was never flashy, but it was reliable and showed no sign of overheating.
但那只是爱默生的股票。那爱默生公司呢？在1999年，爱默生销售了价值144亿美元的商品和服务，比前一年增加了近10亿美元。在这些收入中，爱默生净收入13亿美元，比1998年增加了 6.9%。在过去的5年中，每股收益以 8.3% 的强劲平均速度增长。爱默生的股息已经增加了1倍多，达到每股 1.30 美元，账面价值已经从 6.69 美元增加到每股 14.27 美元。根据 Value Line 的数据，整个90年代，爱默生的净利润率和资本回报率，衡量其作为一家企业效率的关键指标，一直保持在高位，分别约为 9% 和 18%。更重要的是，爱默生已经连续42年增加了其收益，并且已经连续43年提高了其股息，这是美国企业中持续增长最长的记录之一。年底时，爱默生的股票价格是公司每股净收入的 17.7 倍。就像它的电动工具一样，爱默生从来不会显眼，但它是可靠的，并且没有过热的迹象。
Could EMC grow PDQ?
EMC 能否快速增长？
EMC Corporation was one of the best performing stocks of the 1990s, rising, or should we say levitating, more than 81,000%. If you had invested $10,000 in EMC's stock at the beginning of 1990, you would have ended 1999 with just over $8.1 million. EMC's shares returned 157.1% in 1999 alone, more than Emerson's stock had gained in the 8 years from 1992 through 1999 combined. EMC had never paid a dividend, instead retaining all its earnings to provide funds for the continued growth of the company, one at their December 31st price of $54.625. EMC's shares were trading at 103 times the earnings the company would report for the full year, nearly 6 times the valuation level of Emerson stock.
EMC 公司是20世纪90年代表现最好的股票之一，上涨，或者我们应该说悬浮，超过81,000百分号。如果你在1990年初投资了1万美元在 EMC 的股票，到1999年底你就会拥有超过810万美元。仅在1999年 EMC 的股票就回报了 157.1 百分号，超过了爱默生股票从1992年到1999年8年间的总收益。EMC 从未支付过股息，而是保留了所有的收益以提供公司持续增长的资金。在12月31日的价格为 54.625 美元时， EMC 的股票交易价格是公司全年收益的103倍，几乎是爱默生股票估值水平的6倍。
What about EMC the business? Revenues grew 24% in 1999, rising to $6.7 billion. Its earnings per share soared to 92 cents from 61 cents the year before, a 51% increase. Over the 5 years ending in 1999, EMC's earnings had risen at a sizzling annual rate of 28.8%. And, with everyone expecting the tidal wave of internet commerce to keep rolling, the future looked even brighter. Throughout 1999, EMC's chief executive repeatedly predicted that revenues would hit $10 billion by 2001. Up from $5.4 billion in 1998.2, that would require average annual growth of 23%, a monstrous rate of expansion for so big a company. But Wall Street's analysts and most investors were sure EMC could do it. After all, over the previous 5 years, EMC had more than doubled its revenues and better than tripled its net income.
那么 EMC 的业务呢？1999年收入增长了 24%， 达到67亿美元。其每股收益从前一年的61美分飙升到92美分，增长了 51%。在截至1999年的5年中 ，EMC 的收益以每年 28.8% 的惊人速度增长。而且，由于大家都期待互联网商务的海啸会继续滚滚而来，未来看起来更加光明。在整个1999年，EMC 的首席执行官反复预测，到2001年，收入将达到100亿美元，从1998年的54亿美元上升。这将需要平均每年增长 23%。对于如此大的公司来说，这是一个巨大的扩张速度。但华尔街的分析师和大多数投资者都确信 EMC 能做到。毕竟，在过去的5年中 ，EMC 已经将其收入增加了1倍多，净收入增加了3倍以上。
But from 1995 through 1999, according to Value Line, EMC's net profit margin slid from 19.0% to 17.4%, while its return on capital dropped from 26.8% to 21%. Although still highly profitable, EMC was already slipping. And in October 1999, EMC acquired Data General Corporation, which added roughly $1.1 billion to EMC's revenues that year. Simply by subtracting the extra revenues brought in from Data General, we can see that the volume of EMC's existing businesses grew from $5.4 billion in 1998 to just $5.6 billion in 1999, a rise of only 3.6%. In other words, EMC's true growth rate was almost nil, even in a year when the scare over the Y2K computer bug had led many companies to spend record amounts on new technology. Point 3.
但是从1995年到1999年，根据 Value Line 的数据 ，EMC 的净利润率从 19.0% 下滑到 17.4%， 而其资本回报率从 26.8% 下降到 21%。尽管仍然高利润，但 EMC 已经开始下滑，并且在1999年10月 ，EMC 收购了 Data General Corp， 这使得 EMC 当年的收入增加了大约11亿美元。仅仅通过减去 Data General 带来的额外收入，我们就可以看到 EMC 现有业务的体量从1998年的54亿美元增长到1999年的56亿美元，增长仅为 3.6%。换句话说 ，EMC 的真正增长率几乎为零。即使在千年虫计算机问题引发的恐慌，使得许多公司在新技术上投入了创纪录的资金的一年。
A simple twist of freight.
货运的简单扭转。
Unlike EMC, Expeditors International hadn't yet learned to levitate. Although the firm's shares had risen 30% annually in the 1990s, much of that big gain had come at the very end, as the stock raised to a 109.1% return in 1999. The year before, Expeditors shares had gone up just 9.5%, trailing the S&P 500 index by more than 19 percentage points.
与 EMC 不同，国际货运公司尚未学会漂浮。尽管该公司的股票在1990年代每年上涨 30%， 但大部分的大幅增长都是在最后出现的。股票在1999年飙升至 109.1% 的回报。在此之前的一年，国际货运公司的股票仅上涨了 9.5%， 落后于标准普尔500指数超过19个百分点。
What about the business? Expeditors was growing expeditiously indeed. Since 1995, its revenues had risen at an average annual rate of 19.8%, nearly tripling over the period to finish 1999 at $1.4 billion. And earnings per share had grown by 25.8% annually, while dividends had risen at a 27% annual clip. Expeditors had no long-term debt, and its working capital had nearly doubled since 1995. According to Value Line, Expeditors' book value per share had increased 129%, and its return on capital had risen by more than 1/3 to 21%.
那么这个业务呢？国际货运公司的确在迅速增长。自1995年以来，其收入以每年 19.8% 的平均速度增长，几乎在此期间翻了3倍，到1999年底达到14亿美元。每股收益每年增长 25.8%。而股息以每年 27% 的速度增长。国际货运公司没有长期债务，其营运资本自1995年以来几乎翻了一番。根据 Value Line 的数据，国际货运公司的每股账面价值增长了 129%， 其资本回报率增长了超过1/3，达到 21%。
By any standard, Expeditors was a superb business. But the little freight forwarding company, with its base in Seattle and much of its operations in Asia, was all but unknown on Wall Street. Only 32% of the shares were owned by institutional investors. In fact, Expeditors had only 8,500 shareholders. After doubling in 1999, the stock was priced at 39 times the net income Expeditors would earn for the year, no longer anywhere near cheap, but well below the vertiginous valuation of EMC.
以任何标准来看，国际货运公司都是一家出色的企业。但这家小型的货运代理公司以西雅图为基地，大部分业务在亚洲，却在华尔街几乎无人知晓。只有 32% 的股份由机构投资者持有。实际上，国际货运公司只有8500名股东。在1999年翻了一番后，该股票的价格是国际货运公司当年净收入的39倍，已经不再便宜，但远低于 EMC 的高估值。
The Promised Land?
应许之地。
By the end of 1999, Exodus Communications seemed to have taken its shareholders straight to the land of milk and honey. The stock soared 1,005.8% in 1999, enough to turn a $10,000 investment on January 1st into more than $110,000 by December 31st. Wall Street's leading internet stock analysts, including the hugely influential Henry Blodgett of Merrill Lynch, were predicting that the stock would rise another 25% to 125% over the coming year.
到1999年底 Exodus 通信似乎已经将其股东直接带到了奶与蜜之地。该股票在1999年飙升了1005.8分号，足以将1月1日投资的1万美元在12月31日变为超过11万美元。华尔街领先的互联网股票分析师，包括美林证券极具影响力的亨利·布洛杰特，预测该股票在来年将在上涨25%到125%。
And best of all, in the eyes of the online traders who gorged on Exodus's gains, was the fact that the stock had split 2, 4, 1 3 times during 1999. In a 2, 4, 1 stock split, a company doubles the number of its shares and halves their price, so a shareholder ends up owning twice as many shares, each priced at half the former level. What's so great about that? Imagine that you handed me a dime, and I then gave you back 2 nickels and asked, "Don't you feel richer now?" You would probably conclude either that I was an idiot or that I had mistaken you for one. And yet, in 1999's frenzy over .com stocks, online traders acted exactly as if 2 nickels were more valuable than 1 dime. In fact, just the news that a stock would be splitting 2, 4, 1 could instantly drive its shares up 20% or more.
最好的是，在那些狂热于 Exodus 收益的在线交易者眼中，该股票在1999年期间已经进行了3次2:1的股票拆分。在2:1的股票拆分中，公司将其股票数量翻倍，价格减半，所以股东最终拥有的股票数量翻倍，每股价格为原来的1半。这有什么好处呢？想象一下，你给我1枚1角硬币，然后我给你回2枚5分硬币，问你现在感觉更富有了吗？你可能会得出结论，要么我是个傻瓜，要么我把你当成了傻瓜。然而，在1999年对点股票的狂热中，在线交易者的行为完全就像2枚5分硬币比1枚1角硬币更有价值。事实上，只是一个股票将进行2:1拆分的消息，就能立即使其股价上涨20%或更多。
Why? Because getting more shares makes people feel richer. Someone who bought 100 shares of Exodus in January watched them turn into 200 when the stock split in April. Then those 200 turned into 400 in August. Then the 400 became 800 in December. It was thrilling for these people to realize that they had gotten 700 more shares just for owning 100 in the first place. To them, that felt like found money, never mind that the price per share had been cut in half with each split. 4 in December 1999, one elated Exodus shareholder, who went by the handle "Give me $1," exulted on an online message board. "I'm going to hold these shares until I'm 80, because, after it splits hundreds of times over the next years, I'll be close to becoming CEO." 5.
为什么呢？因为拥有更多的股票让人们感觉更富有。那些在1月份买入100股 Exodus 的人，看到他们在4月份股票拆分时变成了200股，然后那200股在8月份变成了400股，然后那400股在12月份变成了800股。这些人意识到，他们只因为最初拥有100股就获得了700股，这对他们来说是令人兴奋的。对他们来说， 这就像是找到的钱，尽管每次拆分都将每股价格削减了一半。在1999年12月，一位欣喜若狂的 Exodus 股东，网名为 Give Medaler， 在一个在线留言板上欢呼：“我要持有这些股票，直到我80岁，因为在接下来的几年里，它将分裂数百次，我将接近成为 CEO。”
What about Exodus the business? Graham wouldn't have touched it with a 10-foot pole and a hazmat suit. Exodus's revenues were exploding, growing from $52.7 million in 1998 to $242.1 million in 1999. But it lost $130.3 million on those revenues in 1999, nearly double its loss the year before. Exodus had $2.6 billion in total debt and was so starved for cash that it borrowed $971 million in the month of December alone. According to Exodus's annual report, that new borrowing would add more than $50 million to its interest payments in the coming year. The company started 1999 with $156 million in cash and, even after raising $1.3 billion in new financing, finished the year with a cash balance of $1 billion, meaning that its businesses had devoured more than $400 million in cash during 1999. How could such a company ever pay its debts?
那么 Exodus 这个业务呢？格雷厄姆不会用10英尺长的杆子和防护服去碰它。Exodus 的收入正在爆炸式增长，从1998年的5270万美元增长到1999年的2.421亿美元，但它在1999年的这些收入上亏损了1.303亿美元，几乎是前一年亏损的2倍。Exodus 有26亿美元的总债务，并且如此急需现金，以至于他在12月份1个月内借款了9.71亿美元。根据 Exodus 的年度报告，这笔新借款将在来年增加超过5000万美元的利息支出。该公司在1999年初拥有1.56亿美元的现金，即使在筹集了13亿美元的新融资后，年底的现金余额也只有10亿美元。这意味着其业务在1999年期间消耗了超过4亿美元的现金。这样的公司如何能偿还债务呢？
But, of course, online traders were fixated on how far and fast the stock had risen, not on whether the company was healthy. This stock, bragged a trader using the screen name of launch_pad1999, will just continue climbing to infinity and beyond. 6.
但是，当然，在线交易者关注的是股票上涨的速度和幅度，而不是公司是否健康。这只股票，一个使用 launch_pad 1999屏幕名的交易者自夸道，将继续攀升到无穷大。
The absurdity of launch_pad's prediction, what is beyond infinity, is the perfect reminder of one of Graham's classic warnings. Today's investor, Graham tells us.
launch_pad 的预测的荒谬性，什么是超越无穷大？完美的提醒了我们格雷厄姆的经典警告。今天的投资者格雷厄姆告诉我们
is so concerned with anticipating the future that he is already paying handsomely for it in advance. Thus what he has projected with so much study and care may actually happen and still not bring him any profit. If it should fail to materialize to the degree expected, he may in fact be faced with a serious temporary and perhaps even permanent loss. 7.
过于关注预测未来，以至于他已经提前为未来付出了高昂的代价。因此，他经过如此多的研究和关注，所预测的事情可能真的会发生，但仍然无法为他带来任何利润。如果预期的程度没有实现，他可能实际上会面临严重的暂时，甚至可能是永久的损失。7.
Where the ES ended up.
ES 的最终去向。
How did these 4 stocks perform after 1999?
这4只股票在1999年之后的表现如何？
Emerson Electric went on to gain 40.7% in 2000. Although the shares lost money in both 2001 and 2002, they nevertheless ended 2002 less than 4% below their final price of 1999.
爱默生电器在2000年增长了 40.7%。尽管该股票在2001年和2002年都亏损，但在2002年底，它的价格仍然比1999年底的最终价格低不到 4%。
EMC also rose in 2000, gaining 21.7%. But then the shares lost 79.4% in 2001 and another 54.3% in 2002. That left them 88% below their level at year-end 1999. What about the forecast of $10 billion in revenues by 2001? EMC finished that year with revenues of just $7.1 billion and a net loss of $508 million.
EMC 在2000年也上涨，增长了21.7%，但然后该股票在2001年下跌了79.4%，在2002年又下跌了54.3%，这使得他们在1999年底的水平下跌了88%。那么预测的2001年100亿美元的收入呢？ EMC 在那一年的收入只有71亿美元，净亏损5.08亿美元。
Meanwhile, as if the bear market did not even exist, Expeditors International shares went on to gain 22.9% in 2000, 6.5% in 2001, and another 15.1% in 2002, finishing that year nearly 51% higher than their price at the end of 1999.
与此同时，就好像熊市根本不存在一样，捷时国际的股票在2000年增长了22.9%，在2001年增长了6.5%。在2002年又增长了15.1分号，在那一年结束时，它们的价格比1999年底高出近51%。
Exodus's stock lost 55% in 2000 and 99.8% in 2001. On September 26, 2001, Exodus filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Most of the company's assets were bought by Cable and Wireless, the British telecommunications giant. Instead of delivering its shareholders to the promised land, Exodus left them exiled in the wilderness. As of early 2003, the last trade in Exodus's stock was at 1 penny a share.
Exodus 的股票在2000年下跌了55%，在2001年下跌了99.8%。2001年9月26日 ，Exodus 申请了第11章破产保护。公司的大部分资产被英国电信巨头 Cable 与 Wireless 收购。Exodus 没有把他的股东带到承诺的土地，而是让他们流放在荒野中。截至2003年初 ，Exodus 的股票最后一次交易价格是每股1分钱。
Chapter 14. Stock Selection for the Defensive Investor.
第14章防御性投资者的股票选择。
It is time to turn to some broader applications of the techniques of security analysis. Since we have already described in general terms the investment policies recommended for our two categories of investors, it would be logical for us now to indicate how security analysis comes into play in order to implement these policies. The defensive investor who follows our suggestions will purchase only high-grade bonds plus a diversified list of leading common stocks. He is to make sure that the price at which he bought the latter is not unduly high as judged by applicable standards.
现在是时候转向证券分析技术的一些更广泛的应用。由于我们已经大致描述了我们为两类投资者推荐的投资策略，星号现在我们应该指出如何运用证券分析来实施这些策略。遵循我们建议的防御性投资者只会购买高级债券和一份多元化的主要普通股名单。他要确保他购买后者的价格并未根据适用的标准过高。
In setting up this diversified list, he has a choice of two approaches, the DJIA type of portfolio and the quantitatively tested portfolio. In the first, he acquires a true cross-section sample of the leading issues, which will include both some favored growth companies, whose shares sell at especially high multipliers, and also less popular and less expensive enterprises. This could be done, most simply perhaps, by buying the same amounts of all 30 of the issues in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, DJIA. 10 shares of each, at the 900 level for the average, would cost an aggregate of about $16,000.1 on the basis of the past record. He might expect approximately the same future results by buying shares of several representative investment funds.
在设立这个多元化的名单时，他可以选择两种方法，一种是 DJIA 类型的投资组合，另一种是经过量化测试的投资组合。在第一种方法中，他会获取一份真正的领先问题的横截面样本，其中包括一些受欢迎的增长公司，这些公司的股票以特别高的倍数出售，也包括一些不太受欢迎和价格较低的企业。这可以通过购买道琼斯工业平均指数 DJIA 中的所有30个问题的相同数量来完成。每个问题购买10股，平均水平为900，总计大约需要花费16000美元。根据过去的记录，他可能期望通过购买几个代表性投资基金的股票获得大致相同的未来结果。
His second choice would be to apply a set of standards to each purchase to make sure that he obtains 1. A minimum of quality in the past performance and current financial position of the company, and also 2. A minimum of quantity in terms of earnings and assets per dollar of price. At the close of the previous chapter, we listed 7 such quality and quantity criteria suggested for the selection of specific common stocks. Let us describe them in order.
他的第二个选择是对每一次购买应用一套标准，以确保他获得1. 公司过去的表现和当前的财务状况的最低质量，以及2. 以价格每美元计的收益和资产的最低数量。在上一章的结尾，我们列出了7个这样的质量和数量标准，建议用于选择特定的普通股。让我们按顺序描述它们。
1. Adequate size of the enterprise.
一企业的规模足够大。
All our minimum figures must be arbitrary and especially in the matter of size required. Our idea is to exclude small companies which may be subject to more than average vicissitudes, especially in the industrial field. There are often good possibilities in such enterprises, but we do not consider them suited to the needs of the defensive investor. Let us use round amounts, not less than $100 million of annual sales for an industrial company and not less than $50 million of total assets for a public utility.
我们所有的最低数字都必须是任意的，特别是在需要的规模问题上。我们的想法是排除那些可能受到超过平均波动的小公司，特别是在工业领域。这样的企业往往有很好的可能性，但我们认为它们不适合防御性投资者的需要，让我们使用整数。对于工业公司，年销售额不得低于1亿美元；对于公用事业，总资产不得低于5000万美元。
2. A sufficiently strong financial condition.
2. 财务状况足够强大。
For industrial companies, current assets should be at least twice current liabilities, a so-called 2-to-1 current ratio. Also, long-term debt should not exceed the net current assets, or working capital. For public utilities, the debt should not exceed twice the stock equity at book value.
对于工业公司，流动资产应至少是流动负债的2倍，所谓的2:1的流动比率。此外，长期债务不应超过净流动资产或营运资本。对于公用事业，债务不应超过股本的2倍，以账面价值计。
3. Earning stability.
3. 收益稳定。
Some earnings for the common stock in each of the past 10 years.
过去10年中，普通股每年都有一些收益。
4. Dividend record.
4. 股息记录。
Uninterrupted payments for at least the past 20 years.
至少在过去的20年里，支付未间断。
5. Earnings growth.
5. 收益增长。
A minimum increase of at least 1/3 in per share earnings in the past 10 years using 3-year averages at the beginning and end.
过去10年中，每股收益至少增长1/3，使用开始和结束时的3年平均值进行计算。
6. Moderate price/earnings ratio.
6. 适度的价格收益比率。
Current price should not be more than 15 times average earnings of the past 3 years.
当前价格不应超过过去3年平均收益的15倍。
7. Moderate ratio of price to assets.
7. 适度的价格资产比率。
Current price should not be more than 1.5 times the book value last reported. However, a multiplier of earnings below 15 could justify a correspondingly higher multiplier of assets. As a rule of thumb, we suggest that the product of the multiplier times the ratio of price to book value should not exceed 22.5. This figure corresponds to 15 times earnings and 1.5 times book value. It would admit an issue selling at only 9 times earnings and 2.5 times asset value, etc.
当前价格不应超过最后报告的账面价值的 1.5 倍。然而，如果收益的倍数低于15，就可以证明资产的倍数相应的更高。作为经验法则，我们建议乘数与价格与账面价值的比率的乘积不应超过 22.5。这个数字对应于收益的15倍和账面价值的 1.5 倍。它将允许一个问题以收益的9倍和资产价值的 2.5 倍的价格出售，等等。
General comments. These requirements are set up especially for the needs and the temperament of defensive investors. They will eliminate the great majority of common stocks as candidates for the portfolio, and in 2 opposite ways. On the one hand, they will exclude companies that are 1. Too small, 2. in relatively weak financial condition, 3. with a deficit stigma in their 10-year record, and 4. not having a long history of continuous dividends. Of these tests, the most severe under recent financial conditions are those of financial strength. A considerable number of our large and formerly strongly entrenched enterprises have weakened their current ratio or overexpanded their debt, or both, in recent years.
一般评论，这些要求是特别为防御性投资者的需求和性格设立的。他们将排除大多数普通股作为投资组合的候选对象，而且方式各异。一方面，他们将排除那些一太小、二财务状况相对较弱、三在过去10年的记录中有赤字污点，以及四没有长期连续分红历史的公司。在最近的金融条件下，这些测试中最严格的是财务实力。我们的大量大型和以前牢固的企业在近年来已经削弱了他们的流动比率，或过度扩大了他们的债务，或两者兼有。
Our last two criteria are exclusive in the opposite direction, by demanding more earnings and more assets per dollar of price than the popular issues will supply. This is by no means the standard viewpoint of financial analysts. In fact, most will insist that even conservative investors should be prepared to pay generous prices for stocks of the choice companies. We have expounded our contrary view above. It rests largely on the absence of an adequate factor of safety when too large a portion of the price must depend on ever-increasing earnings in the future. The reader will have to decide this important question for himself after weighing the arguments on both sides.
我们的最后两个标准在相反的方向上是排他的，要求每1美元价格的收益和资产更多，而这是流行问题无法提供的。这绝不是金融分析师的标准观点。事实上，大多数人会坚持，即使是保守的投资者也应该准备为优质公司的股票支付慷慨的价格。我们已经在上面阐述了我们的相反观点。它主要基于当价格必须依赖于未来不断增长的收益的过大部分时，安全因素的缺乏。读者将不得不在权衡双方的论点后，为自己决定这个重要的问题。
We have nonetheless opted for the inclusion of a modest requirement of growth over the past decade. Without it, the typical company would show retrogression, at least in terms of profit per dollar of invested capital. There is no reason for the defensive investor to include such companies, though if the price is low enough they could qualify as bargain opportunities.
尽管如此，我们仍选择包括过去10年的适度增长要求。如果没有它，典型的公司将表现出倒退，至少在每1美元投资资本的利润方面是这样。防御性投资者没有理由包括这样的公司，尽管如果价格足够低，他们可以作为便宜的机会。
The suggested maximum figure of 15 times earnings might well result in a typical portfolio with an average multiplier of, say, 12 to 13 times. Note that in February 1972, American Intel, sold at 11 times its 3-year and current earnings, and Standard Oil of California at less than 10 times latest earnings. Our basic recommendation is that the stock portfolio, when acquired, should have an overall earnings/price ratio the reverse of the P/E ratio, at least as high as the current high-grade bond rate. This would mean a P/E ratio no higher than 13.3 against an AA bond yield of 7.5%.
建议的最高收益15倍的数字可能会导致一个典型的投资组合平均乘数为，比如说12到13倍。注意，1972年2月，美国电话电报公司以其3年和当前收益的11倍的价格出售，加利福尼亚标准石油公司以不到最新收益的10倍的价格出售。我们的基本建议是，当购买时，股票投资组合应该有一个总体的收益价格比率 P/E 比率的反向，至少与当前的高级债券利率一样高。这将意味着 P/E 比率不高于 13.3， 对应于 AA 债券的收益率为 7.5%。
Application of our criteria to the DJIA at the end of 1970.
将我们的标准应用于1970年底的道琼斯工业平均指数。
All of our suggested criteria were satisfied by the DJIA issues at the end of 1970, but 2 of them just barely. Here is a survey based on the closing price of 1970 and the relevant figures. The basic data for each company are shown in tables 14.1 and 14.2.
我们所有建议的标准都被1970年底的道琼斯工业平均指数满足，但其中2个仅仅达到了标准。 以下是基于1970年的收盘价和相关数据的调查。每家公司的基本数据显示在14-1和14-2表格中。
Size is more than ample for each company.
每家公司的规模都非常充足。
Financial condition is adequate in the aggregate, but not for every company. Point 2.
总体上，财务状况是足够的，但并非每家公司都是如此。2.
Some dividend has been paid by every company since at least 1940. 5 of the dividend records go back to the last century.
自1940年以来，每家公司都支付了一些股息，其中5家公司的股息记录可以追溯到上个世纪。
The aggregate earnings have been quite stable in the past decade. None of the companies reported a deficit during the prosperous period 1961 to 69, but Chrysler showed a small deficit in 1970.
过去10年的总收益一直相当稳定。在1961至69年的繁荣期间，没有一家公司报告亏损，但克莱斯勒在1970年出现了小额亏损。
The total growth, comparing 3-year averages a decade apart, was 77%, or about 6% per year. But 5 of the firms did not grow by 1/3.
总增长比较10年间隔的3年平均值是 77%， 或者说每年约 6%， 但有5家公司的增长不到1/3。
The ratio of year-end price to 3-year average earnings was $839 to $55.50, or 15-1, right at our suggested upper limit.
年末价格与3年平均收益的比率是839比 55.5， 或者说15:1，正好在我们建议的上限。
The ratio of price to net asset value was 839 to 562, also just within our suggested limit of 1.5-1.
价格与净资产价值的比率是839比562，也刚好在我们建议的1/2:1的限制内。
Table 14 basic data on 30 stocks in the Dow Jones Industrial Average at September 30, 1971.
表14-1971年9月30日道琼斯工业平均指数中30只股票的基本数据。
If, however, we wish to apply the same 7 criteria to each individual company, we would find that only 5 of them would meet all our requirements. These would be American Can, American Tel, Intel, Anaconda, Swift, and Woolworth. The totals for these 5 appear in Table 14.3. Naturally, they make a much better statistical showing than the DJIA as a whole, except in the past growth rate. Point 3.
然而，如果我们希望将同样的7个标准应用到每一个独立的公司，我们会发现只有5个公司能满足我们所有的要求。这5个公司是美国罐头公司、美国电话电报公司、安纳柯达公司、斯威夫特公司和沃尔沃斯公司。这5家公司的总数出现在14-3表中。自然，他们的统计表现比整个道琼斯工业平均指数要好得多，除了过去的增长率。3.
Our application of specific criteria to this select group of industrial stocks indicates that the number meeting every one of our tests will be a relatively small percentage of all listed industrial issues. We hazard the guess that about 100 issues of this sort could have been found in the Standard & Poor's Stock Guide at the end of 1970, just about enough to provide the investor with a satisfactory range of personal choice. Asterisk.
我们对这个精选的工业股票群体应用特定的标准，表明满足我们每一个测试的数量将是所有上市工业问题的一个相对较小的百分比。我们猜测，到1970年底，标准普尔股票指南中可能有大约100个这样的问题，足以为投资者提供一个满意的个人选择范围。星号
The Public Utility Solution.
公共事业解决方案。
If we turn now to the field of public utility stocks, we find a much more comfortable and inviting situation for the investor. Here, the vast majority of issues appear to be cut out by their performance record and their price ratios, in accordance with the defensive investor's needs as we judge them. We exclude one criterion from our test of public utility stocks, namely, the ratio of current assets to current liabilities. The working capital factor takes care of itself in this industry as part of the continuous financing of its growth by sales of bonds and shares. We do require an adequate proportion of stock capital to debt. Point 4.
如果我们现在转向公共事业股票领域，我们会发现，对于投资者来说，这是一个更为舒适和吸引人的情况。在这里， 绝大多数的问题似乎都被他们的表现记录和他们的价格比率剔除，符合我们对防御性投资者需求的判断。我们从我们对公共事业股票的测试中排除了一个标准，即当前资产与当前负债的比率。在这个行业，营运资本因素作为其通过销售债券和股票不断融资的增长的一部分而自行解决。我们确实需要股本与债务的适当比例。4.
In Table 14.4, we present a resume of the 15 issues in the Dow Jones Public Utility Average. For comparison, Table 14.5 gives a similar picture of a random selection of 15 other utilities taken from the New York Stock Exchange list.
在14-4表中，我们提供了道琼斯公共事业平均指数中的15个问题的摘要。作为比较，14-5表给出了从纽约证券交易所列表中随机选择的其他15个公用事业的类似情况。
As 1972 began, the defensive investor could have had quite a wide choice of utility common stocks, each of which would have met our requirements for both performance and price. These companies offered him everything he had a right to demand from simply chosen common stock investments. In comparison with prominent industrial companies as represented by the DJIA, they offered almost as good a record of past growth, plus smaller fluctuations in the annual figures, both at a lower price in relation to earnings and assets. The dividend return was significantly higher. The position of the utilities as regulated monopolies is assuredly more of an advantage than a disadvantage for the conservative investor. Under law, they are entitled to charge rates sufficiently remunerative to attract the capital they need for their continuous expansion, and this implies adequate offsets to inflated costs. While the process of regulation has often been cumbersome and perhaps dilatory, it has not prevented the utilities from earning a fair return on their rising invested capital over many decades.
随着1972年的开始，防御性投资者可以有相当广泛的公用事业普通股选择，每一种都能满足我们对表现和价格的要求。这些公司为他提供了他有权要求的简单选择的普通股投资的一切。与道琼斯工业平均指数所代表的知名工业公司相比，他们提供了几乎同样好的过去增长记录，加上年度数字的波动较小，这都是以相对于收益和资产的较低价格提供的。股息回报显著更高。公用事业作为受监管的垄断者的地位，对于保守的投资者来说，无疑是一个优势而不是劣势。根据法律，他们有权收取足够的费用，以吸引他们需要的持续扩张的资本，这意味着对通胀成本的充分抵消。虽然监管过程往往繁琐，可能拖延，但它并没有阻止公用事业在许多年代里对他们不断增长的投资资本获得公平的回报。
For the defensive investor, the central appeal of the public utility stocks at this time should be their availability at a moderate price in relation to book value. This means that he can ignore stock market considerations if he wishes and consider himself primarily as a part owner of well-established and well-earning businesses. The market quotations are always there for him to take advantage of when times are propitious, either for purchases at unusually attractive low levels or for sales when their prices seem definitely too high.
对于防御性投资者来说，此时公共事业股票的中心吸引力应该是他们相对于账面价值的适中价格。这意味着他可以忽略股票市场的考虑，如果他愿意的话，主要考虑自己作为一家成熟且盈利良好的企业的部分所有者。市场报价总是在他需要的时候提供给他，当时机适宜时，无论是以异常吸引人的低价购买，还是当他们的价格明显过高时出售。
The market record of the public utility indexes condensed in Table 14.6, along with those of other groups, indicates that there have been ample possibilities of profit in these investments in the past. While the rise has not been as great as in the industrial index, the individual utilities have shown more price stability in most periods than have other groups. Asterisk, it is striking to observe in this table that the relative price/earnings ratios of the industrials and the utilities have changed places during the past 2 decades. These reversals will have more meaning for the active than for the passive investor. But they suggest that even defensive portfolios should be changed from time to time, especially if the securities purchased have an apparently excessive advance and can be replaced by issues much more reasonably priced. Alas, there will be capital gains taxes to pay, which for the typical investor seems to be about the same as the devil to pay. Our old ally, experience, tells us here that it is better to sell and pay the tax than not sell and repent.
公共事业指数的市场记录在14-6表中与其他群体一起精简，表明在过去，这些投资有大量的利润可能性。虽然上涨没有工业指数那么大，但在大多数时期，个别公用事业的价格稳定性比其他群体更强。星号在这个表中令人惊讶的是观察到，在过去的20年里，工业和公用事业的相对价格收益比率已经互换了位置。这些反转对于积极的投资者比对于被动的投资者有更多的意义。但是，他们建议，即使是防御性的投资组合，也应该时不时的改变，特别是如果购买的证券有明显的过度提升，并且可以被价格更合理的问题所替代。将会有资本利得税要支付，对于典型的投资者来说，这似乎就像是要付出魔鬼的代价。我们的老朋友经验在这里告诉我们，卖出并支付税款总比不卖出并后悔要好。
Table 14.6 Development of prices and price/earnings ratios for various Standard & Poor's averages.
表14-6各种标准普尔平均数的价格和价格收益比率的发展。
Investing in stocks of financial enterprises.
投资金融企业的股票。
A considerable variety of concerns may be ranged under the rubric of financial companies. These would include banks, insurance companies, savings and loan associations, credit and small loan companies, mortgage companies, and investment companies, e.g., mutual funds. It is characteristic of all these enterprises that they have a relatively small part of their assets in the form of material things, such as fixed assets and merchandise inventories. But on the other hand, most categories have short-term obligations well in excess of their stock capital. The question of financial soundness is, therefore, more relevant here than in the case of the typical manufacturing or commercial enterprise. This, in turn, has given rise to various forms of regulation and supervision, with the design and general result of assuring against unsound financial practices.
可以将许多问题归入金融公司的范畴，这些包括银行、保险公司、储蓄和贷款协会、信贷和小额贷款公司、抵押贷款公司以及投资公司，例如共同基金。所有这些企业的特点是，他们的资产中实物形式的部分相对较小，如固定资产和商品库存，但另一方面，大多数类别的短期债务远超过其股本。因此，财务稳健的问题在这里比在典型的制造或商业企业中更为相关。这反过来导致了各种形式的监管和监督，其设计和总体结果是防止不健全的财务行为。
Broadly speaking, the shares of financial concerns have produced investment results similar to those of other types of common shares. Table 14.7 shows price changes between 1948 and 1970 in 6 groups represented in the Standard & Poor's stock price indexes. The average for 1941 to 1943 is taken as 10, the base level. The year-end 1970 figures ranged between 44.3 for the 9 New York banks and 218 for the 11 life insurance stocks. During the subintervals, there was considerable variation in the respective price movements. For example, the New York City bank stocks did quite well between 1958 and 1968. Conversely, the spectacular life insurance group actually lost ground between 1963 and 1968. These cross movements are found in many, perhaps most, of the numerous industry groups in the Standard & Poor's indexes.
广义上讲，金融公司的股份产生的投资结果与其他类型的普通股份相似。表14-7显示了1948年至1970年间在标准普尔股价指数中代表的6个组的价格变化。1941至1943年的平均值被视为是基准水平。1970年年底的数据在9家纽约银行的 44.3 和11家人寿保险股票的218之间变动。在子间隔期间，各自的价格走势有相当大的变化。例如，纽约市银行股票在1958年至1968年间表现相当好，相反，表现出色的人寿保险集团在1963年至1968年间实际上有所下滑。这些交叉运动在标准普尔指数的许多，也许是大多数行业组中都能找到。
Table 14.7 Relative price movements of stocks of various.
表14-7各类股票的相对价格变动。
We have no very helpful remarks to offer in this broad area of investment. other than to counsel that the same arithmetical standards for price in relation to earnings and book value be applied to the choice of companies in these groups as we have suggested for industrial and public utility investments.
在这个广泛的投资领域，我们没有什么特别有帮助的建议可以提供，除了建议在选择这些组中的公司时，应用我们对工业和公用事业投资所建议的相同的价格与收益和账面价值的算术标准。
Railroad issues.
铁路问题。
The railroad story is a far different one from that of the utilities. The carriers have suffered severely from a combination of severe competition and strict regulation. Their labor cost problem has of course been difficult as well, but that has not been confined to railroads. Automobiles, buses, and airlines have drawn off most of their passenger business and left the rest highly unprofitable. The trucks have taken a good deal of their freight traffic. More than half of the railroad mileage of the country has been in bankruptcy or trusteeship at various times during the past 50 years.
铁路的故事与公用事业的故事大不相同。运输公司受到了严重竞争和严格监管的双重打击，他们的劳动力成本问题当然也很困难，但这并不仅限于铁路、汽车、公共汽车和航空公司已经吸引了他们大部分的乘客业务，并使剩下的业务高度不盈利。卡车已经接走了他们大部分的货运业务。在过去的50年里，全国1半以上的铁路里程在不同的时间里都已破产或受托管理。
But this half-century has not been all downhill for the carriers. There have been prosperous periods for the industry, especially the war years. Some of the lines have managed to maintain their earning power and their dividends despite the general difficulties.
但这半个世纪对于运输公司来说，并非全是下坡路。这个行业有过繁荣的时期，特别是战争年代。尽管面临普遍的困难，一些线路设法保持了他们的盈利能力和他们的股息。
The Standard & Poor's Index advanced sevenfold from the low of 1942 to the high of 1968, not much below the percentage gain in the Public Utility Index. The bankruptcy of the Penn Central Transportation Company, our most important railroad, in 1970 shocked the financial world. Only a year and 2 years previously, the stock sold at close to the highest price level in its long history, and it had paid continuous dividends for more than 120 years. On page 423 below, we present a brief analysis of this railroad to illustrate how a competent student could have detected the developing weaknesses in the company's picture and counseled against ownership of its securities. The market level of railroad shares as a whole was seriously affected by this financial disaster.
标准普尔指数从1942年的低点到1968年的高点增长了7倍，与公用事业指数的百分比增长相差不多。1970年，我们最重要的铁路公司宾夕法尼亚中央运输公司的破产震惊了金融界。仅在1年和2年前，该股票的售价接近其长期历史的最高价格水平，并且已经连续支付了120多年的股息。在下面的第423页，我们对这家铁路公司进行了简要分析，以说明一个能力强的学生如何能够检测到公司形象中的发展弱点，并建议不要拥有其证券。这次金融灾难严重影响了铁路股票的整体市场水平。
It is usually unsound to make blanket recommendations of whole classes of securities, and there are equal objections to broad condemnations. The record of railroad share prices in Table 14.6 shows that the group as a whole has often offered chances for a large profit. But in our view, the great advances were in themselves largely unwarranted. Let us confine our suggestion to this. There is no compelling reason for the investor to own railroad shares. Before he buys any, he should make sure that he is getting so much value for his money that it would be unreasonable to look for something else instead. Asterisk.
通常来说，对整个类别的证券进行全面推荐是不合理的，对广泛的谴责也有同样的反对意见。表14-6中铁路股票价格的记录显示，整个群体经常提供了大利润的机会，但在我们看来，这些大幅度的提高本身大部分是不合理的。让我们把建议限制在这里。对投资者来说，没有强 compelling 的理由拥有铁路股票。在他购买任何股票之前，他应该确保他用他的钱得到了如此多的价值，以至于寻找其他东西代替是不合理的。
Selectivity for the defensive investor.
防御性投资者的选择性。
Every investor would like his list to be better or more promising than the average. Hence, the reader will ask whether, If he gets himself a competent advisor or security analyst, he should not be able to count on being supplied with an investment package of really superior merits. After all, he may say, the rules you have outlined are pretty simple and easygoing. A highly trained analyst ought to be able to use all his skill and techniques to improve substantially on something as obvious as the Dow Jones list. If not, what good are all his statistics, calculations, and pontifical judgments?
每个投资者都希望他的投资清单比平均水平更好或更有前景。因此，读者会问，如果他找到一个能干的顾问或证券分析师，他是否应该能够指望得到一个真正优越的投资组合？他可能会说，毕竟你列出的规则相当简单易行。一个高度训练有素的分析师应该能够利用他所有的技能和技术，大大改善像道琼斯指数这样明显的东西。如果不能，那他所有的统计数据、计算和权威判断有什么用呢？
Suppose, as a practical test, we had asked 100 security analysts to choose the best 5 stocks in the Dow Jones average to be bought at the end of 1970. Few would have come up with identical choices and many of the lists would have differed completely from each other.
假设，作为一个实际的测试，我们让100个证券分析师选择在1970年底购买的道琼斯平均指数中的最佳5只股票。很少有人会提出完全相同的选择，许多清单可能会完全不同。